This story contains scenes and scenarios which may be disturbing to some listeners, including scenes involving an infant. Viewer discretion is highly advised. Part 1. The rain spattered gently onto the windshield. As the streaks of water built up and rolled across, they obscured the road ahead. When the wipers had had enough, they swung up to clear the glass before returning to their resting place, waiting to start the cycle over again. The pre-dawn rural Connecticut highway had no signs of other cars, and only the faintest promise of light soon to come. A porous fog filled the world around Jack's car, causing the colors of the tree line and the occasional exit signs he passed to smudge together. As he finished banking around a long curve up a hill, he glanced down at his phone. The GPS still said he had another 43 minutes before he arrived at Bradley Airport. ETA 3:15 a.m. He'd never been great with early mornings, never mind cold November early mornings. A later flight certainly would have been more preferable, but when money's tight, you have to do what you have to do, and the red eyes were the cheapest he could find. The fact that he managed to scrape together the money for a flight in the first place still baffled him. Then again, if everything went well in Idaho, he would get more than his money back. But that was a big if. He slowed a bit to make sure no big bends in the road jumped out to surprise him. He glanced up at the sticky note he'd slid into the clip of his car's sun visor. It had the name of some lawyer from Preston, Idaho, that his father's email had told him to contact when arrived. Nicholas Ectasis, estate lawyer, it read. For how much Jack's parents had hated each other, his mother had refused to even entertain the idea of a divorce. No, instead they just chose to live in a torturous, hate-filled separation. Don't leave the bitch a cent, the email had said. Now that Dad was dead, Jack failed to see how the fortune he'd been sitting on could legally go to anyone but his wife. The money was no joke. He'd won it all in a lawsuit with the old paper mill he worked at. Criminal negligence and chemical mishandling, or something like that. But the email had been adamant that this Nicholas guy would be able to get the money to Jack instead. Even if there was a chance that was true, he felt he had to take it. The fog relented a bit, and more of the road ahead came back into view. So, he let the car pick up speed again. It was hard to keep his eyes open. The speakers in his car had blown out months ago, and he hadn't bothered even asking what they would cost to get fixed. The only thing he could use to stay awake was the shrill sound of music playing from his phone's speakers, nestled snugly in the center console cup holder in a futile attempt to amplify the sound. It didn't help. The old crooked couch hadn't exactly been ideal for a restful night's sleep either, and after the fight with Penelope, he hadn't even been able to fall asleep until well past midnight. He was operating on, at most, an hour and a half of sleep. Hopefully, he could make it up on the plane. His car revved as it attempted to shift with his increase in speed. The transmission had always been finicky, but recently, it had taken to jolting a few times before any gear shift. After 2 quick revs, he could hear the thunk of the engine finding its purchase and propelling the car forward consistently again. Piece of shit, he muttered under his breath. His eyes moved back up from the tachometer to the road, and Jack decided to let himself think about what he was going to do when he touched down in Preston. It had been years since he'd talked to either of his parents. He was sure he wouldn't be able to get far into setting up the funeral arrangements before Mom learned he was in town. Small-town folks were never good at being discreet, and when you were as involved in the town's henhouse of a church as his mother was, there isn't anything you did better than minding other people's businesses. His phone hummed with the faint buzz of a text being received, magnified against the solid plastic of his cup holder. New message from Pen. Shit. He'd have to address that at some point. After the funeral, he muttered. He reached down and used his thumb to swipe the notification up and dismiss it. Glancing down, he noticed the Maps app seemed to have crashed. Damn it. He took a quick look back up through the rain-laden windshield. No cars, no signs, just the white lines of the 2-lane highway into the fog. He reached down to the phone and started a new trip, selecting the airport from the recently visited list. A spinning circle appeared as the phone plotted the course, and he looked back up to the road. He'd turn his attention back just in time to catch the exit sign zip past him on the left. Big and green with white letters, the text, Exit 27, Ross Road, and an arrow pointing to the right, the direction he was heading. The road in front of him was now just one lane, an off-ramp heading into the fog. "Shit," he said as he slowed the car, its transmission chugging in protest. The exit he'd just accidentally taken seemed to be the straight continuation of the highway. It was technically an exit, but it was one of those roads where go straight on the GPS equated to bearing left to stay on the road. He was slowly heading down the off-ramp, the highway falling away into the gray mist and darkness behind him. Why the hell would anyone make a road like that? He thought angrily. He glanced at the GPS and verified what had happened. He could see the highlighted blue route behind him veering left while he continued down the ramp, the spinning loading symbol reappearing along with the words rerouting above it. It quickly returned to the map, telling him to continue straight and turn left in 0.3 miles. The new ETA read 3:25 a.m. Jack calmed a bit. It was still frustrating, but it looked like it was only going to add a couple minutes to get back on the highway. The fog still obstructed the road ahead, but the phone showed the ramp ending at a T-shaped fork in the road. Driving through the mist was significantly more unsettling now that he'd stopped moving at highway speeds. The quiet and lack of visibility was off-putting on the highway, but the streetlights and speed at which they passed made the environment feel less imposing and more so something to view as it flew by. Now that the road had no lights to speak of, and the trees took longer to pass through his periphery, there was no such feeling of detachment. The fog got so thick that his headlights seemed to become a detriment to visibility, the light barely leaving the bulbs before refracting off millions of particles in the air, spreading out and making the windshield nothing but a wall of dim, fuzzed light. Slowly but surely, the fog thinned out just enough that the headlights pierced through. Jack could see the road coming to an end. As he approached the head of the T intersection, he saw that the perpendicular street ran along the bottom of a ridge in the woods. The ground rose up steeply on the other side of the road, with trees standing up as straight as could be, in spite of the slanted earthen floor's gradient. Straight ahead, up against the base of the ridge, the fog began to take on a different coloration. It started dulled, then shifted to a yellow blob that deepened as he approached. When the light from his headlights finally pierced through to the ridge line in earnest, he saw the yellow shape take form. A large, yellow, diamond-shaped street sign indicating the fork in the road. Across it was painted a dual-headed black arrow pointing off to the left and to the right. Jack slowed and came to a stop at the intersection, partially to look left and right, but also a bit unsettled by the metal sign. There was nothing abnormal about it, but in the pre-dawn silence and the enforced obscurity of the fog, the stark yellow of the sign felt out of place. There were no other street signs, nothing indicating lodging or food or gas stations like you'd typically see coming off the highway. In fairness, he thought, this was rural Connecticut. There wouldn't be much out here in the first place. But still, he felt uneasy. The robotic voice of his phone echoed up from his cup holder, feminine and firm. "Turn left in 50 feet. Not seeing any headlights from either direction, Jack pulled the wheel around and took the left, heading down along the ridgeline in the fog. The yellow of the sign took on an almost orange tint in his rearview mirror as it was washed in the red of his taillights, before fading back into the mist and darkness of the road. The phone spoke up again. "In 5 minutes, take a right turn." Jack looked down, confused at the instruction. After verifying he'd put in the correct destination, he shrugged to himself and continued down the road. The tinny bass line of some song he'd long forgotten the name of played through his phone, filling the quiet night. As the trees passed by outside the car windows, the uneasiness Jack had felt started to fade. He wasn't going anywhere near highway speeds, but the woodland road was relatively straight, and as long as he was careful with the fog ahead of him, he was able to comfortably cruise around 40 to 50 miles per hour. He tried flicking on his high beams to get a better look at the tree line, but they only collided with the fog. The more aggressive light did more harm than good in terms of visibility. He decided to leave them off. Jack stole a quick look at the phone. "Turn right in 3 miles." The driving was still monotonous, but being off the highway was nice, even in the eerie quiet of the forest. His ETA had even dropped to 3:20 a.m., probably because he was pushing the road's posted speed limit. Jack was normally a very cautious driver, but there was no one else on the road, and it was nice to take the turns a bit fast. To feel his inertia ever so slightly protest as the car banked. He reached down to the old hand roller he'd reattached countless times and rolled down his driver's side window. The night air was refreshing on his face, and he could hear the chittering of bugs and other wildlife starting to wake up in anticipation of first light. Soon, the ridgeline of the woods to his right tapered off, and he was surrounded by more or less even forest on both sides. The trees thinned out a bit as he approached his turn, and the fog relented as the street ahead came into view. Jack carefully compressed the brake, slowing the car and squinting ahead to verify what he was seeing. The road ended in a similar T-shaped intersection, with the perpendicular road extending to the left and right. Funnily enough, there was a similar ridgeline on the other side of the street as well, albeit a bit less densely packed with trees, banking up and out of sight. Then he saw it. Firmly affixed across the intersection and standing sentinel against the sharp beams of his headlights, a large metal yellow sign. The same dual-headed black arrow sat squarely in the center, gesturing in each direction. The new road stretched along. Jack cocked his head a bit as it came to a stop at the intersection, eyes locked on the sign. It wasn't exactly the same. It was level on its posts and faced straight towards the length of T intersection, just like the last. But this one clearly had some different scratches and dents, and the tree line behind it had clearly changed. Still, it was unsettling to see a scene so close to the one he'd just driven 5 miles away from, like some sort of unnatural déjà vu. "Turn right." The phone's voice shook Jack out of his stare. He looked down to see the light blue highlighted route on his map bend around the turn and continue to the right. Leaning forward, he looked out the windshield to his left to check for oncoming traffic. As expected, nothing but fog and darkness. Taking a bit of a breath to calm himself, he turned the wheel, released the brake, and banked right. As the sign swung out of his view, he couldn't help but let his eyes drag on it. He was being unreasonable. It looked like any street sign, but damn if its bright yellow and unnaturally geometric shape felt out of place on a wooded back road. "Continue straight for 6 miles. Jack looked down at his phone again. 6 more miles, he thought. Just his luck that he happened to take the exit leading directly to a maze of one-way roads that took 11 miles to rejoin the highway. He considered just turning back. The ETA still read 3:20, though, and mulling it over for a minute, he figured he'd taken a left followed by a right. Since the exit he'd accidentally taken was to the right of the highway, it could make spatial sense to have driven a ways left, then turned to go alongside the highway before the next on-ramp. The exit ramp he'd taken was obviously a one-way road anyway, even if he did turn around and go back. He didn't want to risk dealing with the off chance that he'd meet someone coming down it while he tried to go up, especially since it was likely anyone he met on the road at this hour would be a bored night shift highway patrol. So Jack continued down the road, reaching down to turn up the volume a bit on his phone. Looking back, he caught the sign just before the fog overtook it. Definitely not the same one he'd seen before. This one was a bit tilted on its post, so its flat face was directed a bit to the right, watching his car as he drove away. The angle of it caused the red of his taillights to reflect a bit harsher than the last, almost entirely overtaking the yellow and reflecting a glowing ruby light. The road was more of the same. He'd rolled the window back up by now. The refreshments of the wind had quickly lost its appeal as the cold air sucked all the heat from his car. It was stupid of him to have opened the window in the first place. His car took forever to build up any comfortable level of heating. In the couple minutes he'd had the window down, he'd lost the 2 hours of work his AC had put in on the ride so far to get it there. Now he shivered a bit and put his hands to the air vent for some warmth. Even though the temperature dial was set to max heat, the air coming out was even colder than outside. First thing I get with that bastard's inheritance is a new car, he thought to himself. That, and give some to Penn. Maybe that was how he'd fix things. give her enough to make sure she was set for life, and then he'd disappear. A sad, resigned smile found its way to his face at the thought. That might be a way to make the best of himself. Set her up, and then make sure he didn't get the chance to fuck anything up. In 500 feet, choose. The artificial voice startled Jack out of his thoughts. What did it just said? He looked down at his phone and saw that his car's icon was approaching the next intersection. Along the top, where the instruction icon was usually displayed, it showed only a question mark, followed by the word he had been sure he'd misheard. Choose. Puzzled, and with the tiniest fluttering in his chest, Jack looked up at the road. The fog began to give way, and his heart skipped the shortest of beats, settling a bit deeper in his chest. The road ended ahead, with another running perpendicular to it. Behind the new road, the woods banked upwards. And there it was, sitting right across from the spot where the roads met. A big, yellow sign with a dual-sided black arrow. Jack stopped the car about 30 feet from the intersection. As the rolling of the tires slowed and stopped, the only sound left was the rumbling of the engine overlaying the subdued noises of the forest around him. The ends of the headlight beams illuminated the hillside in 2 circles, made oblong as they bent up its slope. They intersected over the sign in a sort of Venn diagram pattern, reflecting an even brighter light over the yellow of the sign and making it stand out against the background even more. What the fuck? He muttered to himself instinctively. He leaned forward and looked to the left and right to try and get a better lay of the intersection itself. There was nothing different from the last intersection, or at least nothing of note. No other signs, no potholes or changes in the terrain big enough to have taken passive note of. This was the same intersection. Again. No, that was stupid. There had been a few turns along the road, but nothing drastic enough to have turned completely around. Well, maybe with the distance, a small turn could have ended up changing his course enough. That had to be it. He'd gotten turned around somehow, ended up back at the intersection. He turned back to his phone to restart his route. It had probably just gotten mixed up whenever he took a wrong turn. But as he picked it up, he saw it had already reverted to rerouting, the spinning circle having reappeared in the center. It was taking some time. He only had 1 bar of service, and it couldn't seem to figure out where he was. The music had stopped as well, with how weak the signal was, which he found especially annoying. He thought he'd downloaded this whole playlist. He stared at the screen anxiously. It continued to spin. The fluttering in his chest was getting harder to ignore. He looked back up into the night. The sign still stood there, a ways ahead, the fog particles in front of it becoming individually visible only as they floated through the light beams emanating from his car, before assimilating back into the haze on the other side. In 50 feet, make a U-turn. Jack's attention snapped back to the phone. It had finally finished, now showing the light blue path he was to follow, curling around and sending him back the way he had come. Okay, this was better. This made sense. Clearly he had taken a wrong turn somewhere, or maybe the GPS hadn't gotten a good enough signal to choose the proper route, or something like that. He took hold of the wheel and slowly spun it, releasing the brake and letting the car twist back down the road. As it did, the yellow road sign swung across his windshield and out of sight. He made a point not to look at it in his rearview mirror. In 4 miles, turn left. The ETA now read 3:40 a.m. This detour was starting to cost him. He should still have plenty of time when he got to Bradley, but Jack never liked leaving things to chance. He took a few slow breaths and grabbed his phone, reshuffling his liked songs before returning it to the makeshift cup holder speaker. As he passed by more trees and traced the slight bends in the road, he tried to look for any distinctive landmarks. Fallen trees, divots in the road, maybe gulches along the side of the pavement, anything to verify where he was and where he'd taken a wrong turn. He gave up after a few minutes. There were a couple of felled trees and bumps here and there, but he quickly admitted that he hadn't been paying enough attention on the drive there to recognize any of them. When alone at 2 a.m. and driving through the foggy woods, it's a lot easier to just fall into an autopilot trance and trust the GPS than to try and stay alert. He was certainly alert now. The chilled air in his car made it harder to feel tired. The AC was still blasting out cool air even though it was set to hot. If anything, the air had only gotten colder. Jack spun the dial back to the off position. Better to just let his body warmth slowly fill the car than have the AC actively cooling it. If he remembered right, he had a sweater somewhere in the back. That would definitely help. Looking ahead, the road was obscured by the fog, but it seemed like it wasn't going to turn anytime soon. With one hand on the wheel, he pushed himself up and to the side with his left foot, spinning just a bit to steal a glance in the back seat. The sweater was hanging off the middle seat, half on the floor. He flicked his head back to the road to make sure nothing had changed. Still straight ahead into the fog. He turned back and quickly grabbed it with his free hand, then sat squarely back in his seat, already working his hand up through the neck hole to prepare for a mid-drive wardrobe addition. As he did so, he looked down at it. Penn had made this one for him for their 2-year anniversary. It was an unadorned, deep maroon knitted sweater, but the inside was thick and soft, like a safety blanket. It was only due to the harsh yellow color in his peripheral vision that he noticed the sign barreling towards him. Jack slammed the brakes as the dots connected in his mind. The car screeched in anger as the brake pads immediately and unapologetically killed all momentum. The car came to a jolting stop just a foot away from the sign. Jack sat pressed against the back of his seat, hands firmly affixed at 10 and 2, knuckles white with effort. The sweater was temporarily forgotten, left to fall to his feet. The silence of the night was all-encompassing when contrasted to the high-pitched and panicked squeal of his brakes moments ago. Jack's heart was pounding with adrenaline. His body was still trying to chemically reorient itself. His mind, however, couldn't seem to care less. It was just transfixed on the shape in front of him. The street sign was so close that it nearly filled his entire windshield. A large, thick, dual-headed black arrow pointing off in either direction. It stood over him, cold, quiet, and still. Street signs are always so much bigger when you see them up close. If Jack were to lay alongside it, the arrow would nearly be his height. After a few moments of stunned silence, the unsettling pit in his chest and the sound of blood pumping through his ears began to be too much for Jack to stand. He pulled his gaze away from the arrow and looked out the windows to his sides. He knew what he would see, but had to be sure. The road met with another in a T-shape. He twisted around to look left. Same thing. Along the other side of the road, where the sign stood, the forest floor sloped up steeply into the fog. That made no sense. He'd only turned around, at most, 2 miles ago. Maybe not even that. He looked back down at his phone. The route was gone. The single cell service bar he'd had before had disappeared, and the app seems to have closed. The fluttering in his chest was back and was quickly turning into a pounding. He attempted to get his phone to reload the route. When it refused, he just zoomed out from his location to try and see where the highway was in relation to him. Without signal, the map wasn't much use. All it showed was his small section of road surrounded by grayed-out grid tiles that refused to populate with any useful information. He looked back down either side of the road. He wasn't going to just keep driving blindly. But what could he do? Jack sat there in silence for a moment. He'd had enough signal to get a route back the way he came from. If he just went back, he could probably use that to see the map and plot his own way back. Yeah, that's what he'd do. And finally get off this road and out of these woods. Looking over his shoulder, Jack grabbed the shifter and moved the gear to reverse. The transmission made its normal subdued clunk as it shifted, followed immediately by a heart-stopping ka-thunk and a high-pitched shearing noise. The car refused to move. Shit, come on! Jack pushed the shifter into drive, then back into reverse, and pressed the gas pedal. He heard the unburdened whirring of something from the engine, but the car remained where it was. Fuck. He slammed his fist into the steering wheel, though there was no honk to accompany it. The horn on his car had gone a long time ago. He knew the car was going to give out in some way or another eventually. But ditching him in the woods in the middle of the night when he had a flight to make had to be the worst-case scenario. Reluctantly, he finished putting on the sweater and reached down to find the lever above his left foot. He gave it a firm pull, and the hood on the front of his car released, popping up just a bit. After unbuckling and verifying he was in park, Jack opened his door and swung both feet out onto the old cracked pavement of the road, pulling himself up to standing and closing the car door behind him. It was much cooler outside than in the car. The sweater helped stave off the air, though he still wasn't comfortable. The street around him was unsettlingly quiet. He listened, but could barely hear anything other than the hum of his idling engine. The fog had persisted, though it seemed like he was in the middle of a particularly thin area. He could see a good 100 feet in any direction. The roads all trailed off before subsuming back into the thick of the deep mist. He turned to look up at the ridgeline and saw an area where it might have leveled off a ways up, though it was made hazy through the blurred air. It had been a starless night on the highway, but now that he was 11 or maybe more miles into the woods, he could see a decent number of them over the tree line above him, looking down. Dawn would be coming within the next few hours, and they'd all dissipate in subservience to their much-needed pier. He tried to find the Big Dipper up there, but couldn't. Made it a lot harder when there were so many more stars than he was used to. Jack turned to the front of his car. The yellow road sign stood sentinel in front of his headlights, cutting their trajectories short and creating two extremely brightly lit circles on the sign. He made his way around, eyes on the sign, until he eventually had to turn his back to shimmy in between it and the hood. The foot of space between the two was very tight, but he shuffled along until he was at the center of the car, then reached under the elevated hood, pulled the release latch, and swung it up. Jack immediately realized he knew nothing about cars. Even alone in the woods, he felt embarrassed for having thought that coming and looking at the engine would have helped him diagnose any kind of issue. He had no real idea what the thing was supposed to look like, even when operating normally. Most parts were segmented into housings and covered with hard plastic tops. That made sense. What was he expecting to see? All the pistons and gears just laid out nicely with little labels? After a moment of scanning defeatedly over the components, he did notice one thing. Out of the plastic top of one of the components, he had no idea which, a small but razor-sharp fragment of a silvery metal protruded, lodged into the plastic. It was hard to tell exactly what it was, but the bulge in the cover around the puncture clearly showed it was just a small, pointed end of a much larger mechanism. The outward bend of the plastic clearly implied that it had burst out from within, and the shearing seam along the sharp edge of the object looked like the metal had been sliced apart. Fuck, he sighed. Jack had no idea what this thing was or how bad the damage inside was, but it didn't seem like his car was driving anywhere anytime soon. Hell, he probably shouldn't even be idling the engine. It might be spinning something in there and causing more damage or something. Hurriedly, he slipped out from between the car and the street sign and ran back to the driver's side door. Opening it, he reached in and pulled the keys from the ignition. The sound of the car stopped all at once, leaving nothing but the dual headlights, the fog passing slowly through them, and the subtle sounds of the forest. He'd been a bit preoccupied with the near crash, but in the sudden silence after the engine quieted, Jack was faced with the absence of music coming from his phone. He grabbed it. No signal. He tried dialing 911. Nothing. Check the weather. Nothing. Open Google. Nothing but the little no-internet dinosaur game staring back at him. He started to resign himself to the fact that he wasn't going to make his flight. Jack slipped the phone into his left pocket. The fog was so thick and cold that it accentuated the low temperatures of the night against his exposed face and hands. He couldn't stay here. It wasn't cold enough that he was worried, but he was lost on some back road with no signal. The forecast for tomorrow had predicted the first snowfall of the approaching winter. The cold would certainly become an issue then. Fuck, why hadn't he packed better clothing? He'd made sure to get the cheapest possible ticket, and they only allowed one carry-on bag. The best he had in terms of winter clothing was the sweater. As he closed the car door, the lights inside went out, and for a moment his eyes strained against the darkness. The little lights that they could make use of came from the dim reflection of starlight that struggled to outline even the simplest shapes. He had to stand in near total darkness for about half a minute before his eyes could finally adjust. The world around him took form again, albeit with a dulled bluish tint. The large road sign in front of the hood of the car still stood tall, the new lighting making the black arrow along its face seem all the darker. There had to be a wrong turn he'd made, or something. This intersection was a near photocopy of the last. He swore it. But no, that didn't make any sense. He clearly had just missed a turn along the way and was letting his imagination run wild. All he had to do was go back the way he came. It would take a while, but once he did, he'd get signal again and be able to call a tow truck. Or, failing that, maybe just 911. Or even Penn. Jack tried to take a deep breath, but felt it catch in his throat as he looked up at the road sign he nearly crashed into. He forced his eyes from it and slung his backpack over his shoulder. After making sure the car was locked, he spun around and started walking along the road he'd driven down just minutes ago, making every effort to ignore the fact that he was certain it had been a straightaway the whole way here. The walk was a long one. Jack's estimate had been that he'd driven maybe 2 miles from the last intersection before almost crashing. 2 miles was a lot further to go on foot than by car. But after 30 minutes had passed, then 40, he started to feel his throat tighten with nervousness, and his tongue turn into a dry and unwelcome hindrance to his attempts to stay calm. Had he missed a turn again? No, that was stupid. Before, when he was driving, maybe he could have missed a hidden turn in the fog, but not now. He had made a point to constantly scan either side of the road for any detour or change in the tree line in hopes that when he found one, it would prove that it had all just been an honest mistake. There had been no turns. By now, the cold was reaching his skin. It had been a slow battle, but his flimsy hat and sweater had lost. Now he could feel the temperature of his chest, arms, and head slowly beginning to dip. Every now and then he'd take a glance around, looking for any distinguishing features of the road before quickly bringing his chin back down to keep the cold air off his neck. The mummer's warmth of it, dispersing through his torso and limbs, would feel wonderful right now. This wasn't the worst he'd wanted to drink since going cold turkey a month ago, but it was certainly getting there. Originally, the descent to stop had been to support Penn. She'd stopped drinking around then, and it had clearly meant a lot to her. Jack figured the least he could do was not to make her watch him drink or stumble home drunk. It had proven much harder than he'd thought. He'd started drinking when he was 10 years old, and started binge drinking at 12. 18 years of a habit wasn't something you just kick in a spur-of-the-moment decision. She'd caught him with a bottle of Jack Daniels a few nights ago. The following few days hadn't been the best of their relationship, to say the least. Jack didn't even remember how he'd ended up with it. He'd heard the news about his father, and he must have just gone into autopilot. He didn't even tell her that his dad had passed until their second day of fighting. She quieted down after that, but that soon led to another, less straightforward and much more aggressive argument. That one landed him on the couch. Also his choice, but still. Jack looked up and squinted. The blurred but familiar outline of a road, a ridgeline and sign came into view. This one, however, was missing the key element of his piece-of-shit car sitting in front of the sign. Perfect. This was the intersection he'd come from. He wasn't that lost. All the panic was just his sleep-deprived brain failing to think logically. He picked up his pace a bit to make it to the intersection and pulled his phone from his right pocket excitedly. Still no signal. His emphatic pace slowed back to a walk, and his smile turned quickly to an irritated, if not unsettled, frown. He tried making calls, Googling. He even tried opening the message Penn had sent him earlier on the road, but none of it would load. Jack let his hand fall back to his side and picked up his pace to a light jog. It took only 3 steps for him to stop in his tracks. Jack stared straight ahead as he, for the first time, really took in the scene in front of him. The road continued forward and was intersected by a perpendicular one as expected, with the ridge rising up behind the other road and a large yellow sign with a dual-sided black arrow firmly in the center, unmoving. The front of the sign was facing right at him, but even from this distance he could see there was something wrong with it. It seemed smaller somehow, almost like it was slightly bent over, like a hunchback, and there was some spot of color in the middle of the solid black of the arrow. He was too far to make out anything definitive in the starlight. After listening to the noises of the forest around him for anything abnormal, he started taking careful steps towards the intersection, cautious to make as little noise as possible against the pavement. The scene slowly gained more defined outlines and colors through the mist. The sign was definitely bent, hunched over, and sort of crushed inwards, like it was bent in half vertically along its center, with the sides folding out towards him. A few more steps, and Jack could make out the discoloration on the sign. Against the pitch black, there was a sort of dirtied white color. It twisted in a haphazard shape of short, jagged lines connected to one another. It wasn't until he was about 50 feet from the sign before he noticed the grayish-brown mass lying in front of the sign. Jack stopped, eyes locked on the mound below the sign. It was one solid color all around, and looked almost soft. Maybe a jacket. Oh God. Was it a body? Hello? Jack reluctantly voiced towards it. No response. After a moment, Jack noticed the body had a few thinner sections protruding out from one side, some of them slightly curved. They ended in... What was that? He slowly took another step forward. Hooves. They were hooves. A feeling of relief immediately washed over Jack. It was a deer, or an elk, or whatever. His breathing, which had fully ceased and not restarted since the shape had come into sight, returned to a shaky but stable pattern. As the fear of finding a human body passed, the upsetting scene in front of him began to sink in. The deer was clearly dead. Taking a few more gentle steps towards it, the rest came clearly into sight. The deer laid half on its side, prostrate in front of the street sign. Two of its legs were splayed out to the side, while the others seemed to be broken in half, covered by the bulk of its torso. Its head lolled to the side, mouth slightly agape, and eyes looking lifelessly upwards. It had only one antler on its left side. There was a sharp and jagged stump where the right antler should protrude, lodged within bloodied and minced exposed flesh. Its entire right temple seemed ground to a mess. A dried blood surrounded it and flowed down its face into its glassy cuticles, before finally congealing on the scruff of its tangled jaw fur. Jack felt his stomach turn, and he shot a hand to his mouth instinctively to stop himself from emptying his stomach. After a moment of closing his eyes and collecting himself, nothing came up. One deep breath later, he opened them again and saw that there was more to the sign than he'd seen before. It was certainly crumpled. Hard lines of bent metal all along the center seemed to imply it had been battered repeatedly. Here and there were small holes punched into the sheet metal with sharp, frayed edges poking out of the back. The off-white zigzag he had noticed from afar was, in fact, the deer's right antler. It stuck out from the metal, punctured partially through. The stubby end of it had flakes of flesh still connected and was coated with a deep, blackish red blood. The crimson liquid trailed widely beneath it, spreading out along the bottom of the sign and down to the deer's corpse. Leaning slightly to the side, Jack could see that the antler had certainly pierced the sign, and from the look of it, the sharp edges created by the sheet metal had acted as barbs, embedding themselves into the bone and locking the antler into place. His eyes wandered to the other pockmarks and jagged holes in the center of the sign. They were each surrounded by bent metal corners, implying repeated and powerful impacts. He looked back down at the deer. His chest was a tightly bound knot. He'd already been fending off a manic episode, but the scene in front of him, coupled with the absolute silence of the night, was causing his heart to spin. It felt like his arteries were tying into knots, and his chest got heavier and warmer as his breathing picked up pace. Jack forced his eyes shut, hard. Stop. Breathe. It's an animal. It's fucked, I know, but it was probably just rabid or something. Ran into the sign after you left and killed itself. This doesn't change anything. With his eyes still closed, he turned away so he would not have to see the body as he opened them. Just get a tow. He lifted his phone and lit up the screen. One bar. Jack almost teared up for a moment in elation. See? Nothing to worry about. He unlocked the phone and quickly dialed 911. It might be a bit overkill, but he wasn't sure how long the signal would last and didn't want to risk trying to Google a tow company only to lose it. That, and he had no idea where he was. 911 had all that fancy phone tracking shit to find him. This was just the easiest option. He'd ask for forgiveness later. As he raised the phone to his ear, he sat in silence as it made the dial-up noise. For what seemed like far, far too long, he didn't breathe, hoping to hear the comforting ringing noise of a call attempting to connect. Then it did. The final rhythmic buzz of a call ringing was unimaginably gratifying to hear, and he let himself release his bated breath with a short and involuntary laugh. Thank fucking God. Soon after, a soft female voice came over the line. Your call could not be completed as dialed. You will now be disconnected. His grin fell and his fingers tightened around the phone. He brought it down from his ear and looked at the screen. One bar of signal still remained, but the call had stopped ringing. The number dialed was written above the keypad, clear as day. 911. He could hear a faint, "Thank you, have a wonderful day," come up from the speaker before the call ended itself. No, fuck, come on! He heard himself growl at the phone. A tiny snap of a stick from behind him. He spun only in time to see a smear of blood where the carcass had been. A short glimpse of the deer's mangled head and sullen eyes being dragged along the forest floor as it disappeared into the trees. Jack ran. Part 2. The cold mist sliced through the knitted fabric of his sweater as Jack's sneakers bounded against the pavement. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew what little body heat he had left was getting carried off with the night air. His vision tunneled, blurring the already obscured trees and road on either side of him, only focusing on the asphalt ahead. The road banked to the right, and Jack moved with it, stealing a peripheral glance over his shoulder as he did. In the hazy darkness, he couldn't make out anything beyond 10 or so feet away. The rush of blood in his ears and rhythm of his sneakers smacking against the ground made other sounds hard to pinpoint. Was that a noise? Was that just his panicked sprint? Or was there something else following close behind? His eyes locked ahead again as the bend straightened out. He could have sworn on his father's grave he heard bounding along the road behind him. Or maybe it was just the echoes of his own feverish feet. It didn't matter. He couldn't think. Just run. Logic slipped in and out of his cognition like a piston in its cylinder, forced along by explosions of adrenaline. Just as he would begin to picture the deer's head being dragged away and try to make out what else had been there, another sound would rush into his perception. A gust of wind, a snap of a twig, or a shiver of cold would send his body back into autopilot, ejecting any intelligent thought out of the way to make room for instinct. Jack wasn't sure how long he ran. There were turns in the road, the fog would recede a bit, then come back even stronger than before. Later, when thinking back on it, he would realize he didn't run into a single yellow arrow sign during this time. At least, not one he could see. He could barely make out where his feet landed with each step, but it didn't slow him down for a second. He swore he could hear something behind him, far behind, but there. Eventually, even the adrenaline couldn't keep his legs moving at the pace it was demanding. Jack came to a stumbling jog, catching himself with his arm across his stomach as he nearly heaved from exhaustion and wheezed in the cold mist that had been tightening his airways. A moment passed, and as Jack caught his footing, he took a deep, labored breath and held it. No sound. Even the ambience of the woods was near silent. Jack took his next breaths as controlled as he could, both to calm his body down and to avoid making too much noise. A minute passed, then another. He was safe, for now. Well, not safe, but there wasn't anything chasing him, or at least anything near enough for him to notice. Jack's heart finally slowed its beat, and he could feel his body's fight or flight let go of the grip it had on its psyche. He thought back to the sign in the deer. The deer's head was still limp when he had seen it disappear behind the tree. From the way it had slid along the ground, it had to have been dead. He was sure of it. So something had come up behind him and dragged it away. It must have been that. Maybe a coyote, or even a black bear. Was that something black bears did? Jack looked back into the fog he'd come from. Shit. Now he really had no clue where he was. He'd taken a couple turns while running and hadn't seen any forking paths along the road, but with the panic, it was very likely he'd missed a turn or two in the mist. Now that he'd been stopped for a minute, his body dropped the emergency sensation suppression he'd been enjoying while running, and the depth of the cold on his skin really sunk in. Jack pulled the sleeves of his sweater up just enough to cover his hands, then cupped them together and brought them up to his mouth to exhale hot breath into. He could not stay here. Bears or coyotes or whatever the fuck was out there waiting could come back any time, and daylight wasn't for at least a few more hours. He took another shaky breath and realized he could see his breath float up in front of his face as it left his lungs. He had to just keep walking, he reasoned. He was on a road, and roads lead somewhere eventually. It was that, or just stand and wait for another animal. Jack peeled his eyes away from the direction he'd come and turned the other way. He began to walk, slowly this time, with his arms wrapped tight and his chin held down against his sweater for warmth. Time passed. It was harder to keep track of just how long he walked, with the woods around him never ending nor changing. Eventually, he pulled out his phone from his left pocket to check the time. 4:14, 15% battery remaining. Shit. He knew he should conserve battery, maybe only check every now and then in case he came into a pocket of stronger signal. He opened up the settings and enabled power saving mode. The brightness dimmed drastically. That made him feel a bit better. Should get him to the morning. And somebody would have driven by at that point, or soon after, at least. He shut off the screen, slipped the phone back into the pocket, and rewrapped his hands in the sleeves of the sweater. The walk seems to take forever. The road shifted and turned, and it quickly became hard to tell if he'd been walking in circles. Every now and then he'd fumble to find his phone and check it for signal, but to no avail. He was at least grateful there hadn't been any more intersections with the yellow road sign. In fact, there hadn't been any forks in the road or potential turns for him to take. Weirdly, he kind of preferred it that way. The less turns to choose from, the less chance he picked the wrong one and got even more lost. At least this way, he was just heading wherever the road took him. It might not be the right direction, but at least when he got there, it wouldn't be his fault for choosing the wrong turn at some fork miles back. Jack's senses began to dull with boredom after a while. It occurred to him just how insistent the human body and mind's tendency to go from panicked monotony was without constant stimuli. The constant patting of his feet along the pavement and subdued din of the forest around him forced his mind into a sort of complacency, even though he knew he should stay alert for any animals or cars. He was somewhere in between uncomfortably and painfully cold. The temperature had snuggled tightly into the top layers of his skin. The cold seems to be content to stay just there, threatening to bring him to shivers and potentially hypothermia, but not quite forcing the issue. Not yet, at least. It got to such a point that Jack barely took his eyes off his feet. Watching them trudge along the road was so hypnotizing, he almost didn't notice the slight change in the lighting of the night. The fog-diffused baby blue light of the moon that illuminated his feet took on the slightest green shift, almost imperceptible. His brow furrowed as his brain shifted out of neutral gear. Quickly, he looked up and could see an ever-so-faint collection of muggy neon green light sources in the fog ahead, one much higher in the air than the others. They came from a ways down the road, along the right-hand side. Jack hurriedly picked up his pace, hoping it was some form of civilization, a car or maybe a cell tower or something. As he got closer, the fog's veil began to dissipate, and he could make out the shapes and shadows the light sources cast a bit more. One of them, the one lower to the ground, began to take on a warmer white tint as well. Jack's heart skipped as he realized what he was looking at. The white light was from the interior of an old-timey diner. The top of the building had neon green lights along the trim, giving it a classic retro look. His jog turned into a run and then into a sprint as the second light source higher up in the air became clearer. It was a sign with the words Sinipia Diner written in neon lights. The tedium of the endless walk faded quicker than he would have expected. His car had broken down and he was lost in the back country at night with some kind of bear or wolf or something hunting nearby. How the fuck had he managed to get calm? This was a situation where panic was well deserved, and he felt sick with relief as he rapidly approached the first sign of another human he'd seen in hours. As Jack got close, he could see into the diner through the large windows that made up the majority of the walls. His hope sank for a moment, as he didn't see a single person inside from this angle, but quickly returned when he rounded the corner and saw a brown sedan parked out front. Someone was here. Jack closed the distance between himself and the front door in no time. He grabbed the bare metal handle and pulled. Nothing. Pushed. Nothing. He gave the door a few more shakes, but it was locked tight. He stepped to the side of the doorframe and began to bang on the glass, probably more aggressively than he should have, but the panic was rising again, and he wasn't super concerned with proper etiquette at the moment. He cupped his hands around his eyes and pushed up against the glass to get a better look inside. It was pretty simple. A couple of booths, stools set up along a simple metal bar, behind which were an assortment of coffee machines, bottles, utensils, and a small opening in the wall to the kitchen where order tickets could be hung and food could be handed through.
Hello? Hey, is anyone there?
Jack yelled into the window. His own voice startled him. It was the first real sounds that he, or anyone else in the forest, had made in hours. It seemed to carry through the air far more than he'd have liked. And for a quick moment, Jack forgot all about the diner as he twisted his head to scan the road and woods behind him. He held his breath and listened intently. Nothing but fog. Jack's eyes hugged the edge of the road, sweeping back and forth. Without turning his head back around, he started banging on the window with his fist again, much harder this time.
Hello? Please, someone, I think there's something out here with me. Please, let me in. Fuck, come on. I see your car. I know you're here. Please, Eddie.
He turned his head back and nearly fell on his ass in surprise. Just on the other side of the glass, there stood a woman, maybe mid-20s to early 30s, dressed in a well-worn pink dress with an apron over top and a pen and pad tucked into the pocket. The apron bulged out in a large round stomach. She stood there with her head slightly cocked, one hand raised, pulling a headphone from her ear. Her voice came muffled through the pane of glass.
Hi there, hon. Sorry, we're not open for another couple hours.
Jack stifled the adrenaline in his chest. He must have looked like a mess. It occurred to him that a random, neurotic-looking man banging on the window at 4 a.m. was not a very inviting image. He gave a slight, involuntary laugh at the thought. I'm so sorry. My car broke down a few miles back, and I ran into a bear or something in the woods. I probably look like hell. He put his hands out in a sort of look-at-me motion. I can't get any cell service. I'm sorry for slamming the window. I was just so happy to see signs of other people. He tried to give his best embarrassed but charming grin. She gave a smile back and laughed a bit.
Well, you certainly don't look great, sweetie.
Looking at her, Jack could now see the bulge in her apron was because she was very much pregnant, maybe 7 to 8 months.
You said there's a bear out there?
Her eyes turned to the woods on the other side of the road. After a moment, she spoke again.
Let's get you inside.
She moved over to the door and pulled a small keyring from her apron. She had a strong southern accent, Jack thought. Not something he heard very often in Connecticut. She couldn't have been much older than him, but her cadence and accent gave her a very lovable grandmother vibe.
You got promised me you're not some psycho, though. You don't got no weapons or nothing, do you?
She raised an eyebrow at him through the glass of the door. Jack turned out his pants pockets, pulling his car keys and nearly dead phone from the right one. No, ma'am. She paused for a moment with the key just in front of the lock, leaned a bit to look at the fog behind Jack, then turned back to him.
You're one lucky fella, them, such a trusting gal.
With a smile and a click, she unlocked the door and opened it, inviting him in. Jack happily walked in and thanked her again, returning the keys and phone to their pocket. She took one more look up and down the road before closing and locking the door behind him.
Just take a seat in one of the booths there if you like,
she said. Jack was still recovering from the elation of having found another person. He slid into a booth against the window, and his body's tiredness fully kicked in. The diner was nice and heated. He was starting to feel the tips of his fingertips already, as he cupped his hands to his mouth to speed up the warming process.
You said your car broke down? I'm sorry, hon. Quite a time of day to get stranded.
She laughed as she walked behind the counter to start a fresh pot of coffee.
My brother-in-law, Lloyd, works for a tow company nearby. I'll give him a call in a bit when he's up, and come give you a hand if you'd like. You're not hurt, are you?
She turned to the countertop and began shaping a batch of dough that she must have been working on before Jack interrupted. No, I'm fine, Jack replied, bringing his hands back to the table. Just a bit tired and shook up is all. That'd be wonderful. Thank you so much. I don't know the first thing about cars, but based on how I left it, it didn't look like I'd be able to get it anywhere without a tow. Jack paused for a moment. I don't think I'll be able to pay for the tow outright, though. He fumbled with his hands and looked towards her. I'm good for it, I swear. It just might take me a bit to get the money together.
Oh, don't be silly. Lloyd's family. Besides, he owes me one for forgetting the gift at the baby shower.
She gestured at her belly with one hand while sprinkling flour over the dough with the other. Jack smiled and tipped his head a bit. That's far too nice of you. Thank you, ma'am. He knew he should continue to protest it and insist to at least help pay, but he wasn't in any financial position to do something like that. Oh, and, congratulations. I didn't want to make any assumptions, but that's exciting, he added. The woman gave a bright and cheerful laugh at that.
Why, thank you, sweetie. I must say, this whole process has been a pain at times, but it's very fun watching men squirm trying to decide if they should bring up the baby bump or not.
She winked at him.
Sometimes I pretend not to know what they're talking about when they congratulate me, just to see how they react.
Jack smiled. The scent of warm, fresh dough and the abundance of southern hospitality he was experiencing was a very welcome change to the situation he'd been in minutes ago. I'm Jack, by the way, he said. The woman finished shaping the dough and began cutting it into sections against the floured surface.
Pleasure to meet you, Jack. I'm Primrose. Primrose Sinepia.
Sinepia, Jack repeated, without the same confidence or punctuation Primrose had. I assume you own this diner, then? I saw the sign out front.
No, not me. Sinepia is my married name. My husband's family built this place many years ago. It's an old Greek family name. They can trace their lineage all the way back to 1100 BC. Can you imagine that? As I understood it, the diner's been a bit of a pillar of the community here in town since they started. My husband and I just help out as we can with his folks getting older now.
She started grabbing the rolled out dough and curled them into circles, connecting and forming them. She stopped for a moment and looked at Jack with a contented grin.
Though I must say we've been really enjoying the work, considering taking it over full time. Give the little tyke here a place to run around in and work when they get a bit older.
She patted her round stomach gently before returning to the dough. Well, really, Primrose, I can't thank you enough. You're quite possibly a literal lifesaver. Jack let out a nervous chuckle. The coffee machine gave a faint ding noise as the pot finished filling. Primrose wiped her hands off on her apron and picked up the pot and a mug. She walked out from behind the bar and placed the mug down in front of Jack, filling it up with fresh coffee. Oh, thank you so much, ma'am, Jack said as he picked up the cup. I can't tell you how much I think a little caffeine will do for me right now. Primrose smiled.
Don't take this the wrong way, sugar. But if you could see yourself in the mirror right now, you'd say it's no secret you need some coffee and a good meal.
She pulled the pen and pad from her apron.
What'll it be then? I don't have everything prepped yet, but I can make you a snack of flapjacks or some nice cheesy scrambled eggs.
Jack almost choked on his coffee for a moment before catching the surprised cough in his throat. Oh, I couldn't. You've already helped me out so much.
I won't hear none of that nonsense. You've given me some company during the early morning shift. Consider us even Stevens,
she said.
Now, flapjacks or eggs?
She looked at him expectantly, pen hovering over the pad. Jack grinned. Okay, eggs, then. And thank you again. Primrose checked off a box on her pad of paper and slid it back into her apron's lapel pocket.
Sure thing, sweetie. I'll get right on that.
She gestured to the small metal mesh box on the table with condiments and sweet bottles in it.
We've got some hot sauce right there for you. I haven't gotten the chance to put the salt and pepper out yet, but let me see.
She looked over her shoulder, walked back to the counter, and returned with a few small tearaway packets, placing them on the table in front of Jack.
Here's some salt and pepper, and please, call me Prim.
Jack nodded at her in thanks, and she started to make her way to the kitchen, grabbing the sheet of dough she'd been working on along the way. Just before she walked through the swinging kitchen doors, Jack asked, Prim, I'm very happy you're here, but out of curiosity, what are you doing here in the diner at 4 a.m? Especially if you don't open for a few more hours. Prim turned 90 degrees and used her hips to open the door.
Thank you, Jack. I've had such trouble deciding, she said with a smile. With that, she grabbed a broom she had propped up against the wall next to the door, stepped into the kitchen, and left Jack with his coffee. The door swung back and forth freely until they came to a quiet and controlled stop. Jack stared at the door as it swung. He squinted, trying to figure out how her response could possibly track with what he'd asked. It was strange, but in fairness, he was exhausted. He probably just missed something, or heard her wrong, or something. It didn't matter. He was warm, he had food coming, and a tow. Jack turned his attention back to his hands. He picked up one of the salt packets and started rolling it between his fingers like a coin. Okay, this was good. He knew he'd still have to figure out how to pay for his car and whatever damage was done. And he'd have to figure out a way to make it to Idaho now that he would clearly be missing his flight. With the money he sunk into the plane ticket and whatever the car was going to cost, it was even more important he got to Idaho and got that inheritance money. He knew his mother would not let him see a cent of it if she had her way. His parents despised each other, but Mom hated Jack just as much as his father, if not more. Whatever warmth she'd shown to Jack had disappeared the day his brother, Dean, had died. His dad wasn't much better. The guy had never been a good father, but he still enjoyed spending time with his kids. At least, he did when he wasn't at the bottom of a bottle. Jack's dad was a pragmatic man. He took pride in working for his pay and keeping respectable jobs, but he was not the kind of man to argue when deciding who would pick up the check. In this life, people will try to get things out of you, son. His dad had told him once, after he and Mom had gotten into a particularly bad argument over Dad letting their neighbor pay for the shared fence between their properties. But when things get hard, they will leave you destitute, naked, and covered in your own shit the second you let them. So you take every fucking ounce they give to you while you can. You understand that, Jack? Jack had been 6 at the time. His hand tightened around the salt packet, thinking about it. He reached back and slid it into his back pocket. That was another habit he'd picked up from his father. Whenever he was out and about, he would take just about whatever he could find that was free. Anything from samples at the store to jam and jelly or salt packets at diners like this one. He rarely used the things he took. They all ended up in a junk drawer or the trash, but it was just something he couldn't shake. He looked through the diner window, out into the fog-covered road and woods. Jack hated his father, and he hated the fact that he had to accept all this charity from Prim with nothing to give her in return. Made him feel like Dad. Jack's slow return to a comfortable temperature was almost complete, and his eyelids began to hang heavy. He was exhausted. He looked toward the kitchen and could hear the sound of Prim cracking eggs onto the stove, causing a slight sizzle noise to emanate throughout the otherwise quiet diner. Jack crossed his arms on the table and laid his head on his forearms. He wasn't sure when he dozed off exactly, but it didn't take long. A slight burn in his eyes and heat in his nostrils woke Jack up. He lifted his head and blinked the blurriness out of his vision. How long had he been asleep? He looked out the window. The night was still dark and the fog still hung heavy. As his senses came back to him, he recognized the smell in his nose. Smoke. Jack turned back towards the bar. The room was a bit hazy with fumes like the fog outside. For a moment, while his mind was catching up with his body, he thought he might still be out there in the woods. The concept shot a spike of fear through his chest that refused to subside. He could see a few thin lines of thick black smoke coming up from the kitchen, crawling along the ceiling and out of the order-taking window. Jack stood and immediately started toward the kitchen doors. "Prim?" he said as he swung the door open, fanning the smoke from his face with his hand. The kitchen was small. A large industrial fridge stood against the wall. An island counter with utensils and bowls strewn across it stood in the middle of the room with multiple pots and pans stored above on a variety of hooks and hangers. Prim was nowhere to be seen. After covering the tops of his eyes with his hand, he was able to see the cause of the smoke. A burnt pile of blackened something or other was sitting on top of the grill top, crackling and on fire. The heat on the stove was turned all the way up. Coughing as he went, he quickly made his way over and turned off the grill. The black substance looked like his eggs. They had burned, charred, and hardened on the stovetop, but were still alight and smoking.
He spun and looked around the room, seeing a small fire extinguisher hanging on the wall next to the fridge. He ran and pulled it down, lifting the nozzle, took out the pin, and aimed, releasing the white foam suppressant all over the grill top. The fire immediately went out, and smoke stopped emanating from the eggs. The haze was still heavy in the room, but had already started to dissipate with its source snuffed out. Jack looked around the room again.
Prim? Are you here?
As the smoke cleared, the room became easier to make out. Still, no sign of Prim. A carton of eggs and an open gallon of milk sat on the counter in the center of the room. 3 empty shells lay next to the carton. A metal bowl sat at the center, empty save for some residue from eggs being beaten together. Along the other end of the counter sat a couple dozen golden brown and glazed donuts, stacked on top of one another perfectly. Along the back wall, Jack noticed a door. It sat wide open, going out into the darkness.
Prim?
Jack said, as he walked toward it. Standing at the threshold, he saw it led directly outside. A single step was below the doorframe, leading to a small clearing where a dumpster sat, before yielding back to the forest beyond that.
Prim!
Jack yelled into the woods, his voice carried through the trees. The slight wind vibrated the leaves, carrying the call off and out of sight. He squinted to make out what he could. There were no windows on the back side of the diner, so the only light came from the neon green trim lights that wrapped around the top of the building. The sickly glow combined with the moon's pale illumination in such a way that forced Jack to strain to make sense of what he was seeing. The difficulty to make it out got exponentially harder the farther from the building Jack looked. The thin trees were densely packed, causing the shadows to trick his eyes. It seemed like there was something behind each and every tree, obscured by the medley of shadows, muddy light, and fog. Then, Jack's eyes caught a shape a ways out. This one was different, much more defined compared to the optical illusion he'd been trying to decipher. It looked like a person, standing half obscured by a tree and leaning slightly forward.
Prim?
Jack took a cautious step out of the building, his hand still gripping the door frame. No response.
Prim!
He yelled louder. Still, nothing. He looked to either side, looking for anything moving in the woods, for any reason to not go out there. Then, he looked back at the shape. It almost looked like something leaning against a tree, like they were hurt or maybe sick and holding their stomach.
Fuck!
Jack hissed as he let go of the door frame and started toward the woods. She might be hurt, or could have had an episode, or something.
Prim!
Jack called again, quieter now, as he passed the dumpster and could feel the light around him dimming as he got farther and farther from the building. As he approached, he could see that the shape was mostly shielded from view by a thick tree. He slowed his steps and spoke only in a whisper as he took the bend wide to see the other side.
Prim!
What he saw was made all the more ghastly by the putrid green light wrapping around it, sending deep black shadows stretching into the woods. Prim stood behind the tree, her toes only barely grazing the earth. She was hunched forward, head hanging with her long hair surrounding her features like a thinning, ripped curtain. Jack's hand covered his mouth as he involuntarily let out something between a moan and a sob. The broom she had grabbed earlier was pressed against the ground in front of her. The top of the wooden handle had been split in two, with the smaller portion discarded on the forest floor. The jagged wooden stake that remained had been pushed through Prim's stomach, entering just under her navel and exiting out her back. The thin fabric of her dress and deep green shadows cast from the lights made it painfully easy to see the way the broom handle had interrupted the natural alignment of her spine. Disc and bone had been pushed out of the way, causing them to strain against her skin. The cartilage connecting individual vertebrae had torn in multiple places, making way for the blood-soaked broom handle to protrude in the cavities left behind. Her body leaned forward over the stick in a delicate balance, with the head of the broom wedged into the earth, keeping her partially dangling on top of it. Her pregnant stomach was covered in a sickly, wet trail of blood where the broom had pierced through. The blood turned a brownish maroon color in the green neon light as it dripped, still wet, into a dark, expanding pool on the dirt beneath. Her figure hung there in space, crooked and broken. Jack nearly fainted. This was not something that happened, not in real life. This was... Oh, God. Oh, fucking Christ. Oh. Jack held his mouth so tightly his fingers turned white. He didn't know whether he was holding in vomit or sobs or both. He spun from the sight and looked through the woods, looking for anything that might explain what the fuck had happened. The woods stood in indifferent silence around him, as they always did. He turned back, and this time saw that at Prim's feet, alongside the discarded scrap of the broom handle and pool of blood, there was her pad of paper and her cell phone. He reached for the phone, fighting every instinct that told him not to get any closer. As his hands wrapped around it, he snatched the phone back and turned away from Prim. He couldn't stand looking at her. He had to call someone. He lit up the screen. She had service. It prompted for a passcode, but there was also a bright red emergency call button at the bottom. He pressed it and held the phone to his ear, eyes darting back and forth across the blackness of the woods. The dial tone started up and rang once, twice. An old woman's voice crackled to life in his ears.
911, what's your emergency?
Jack almost cried into the phone, right then and there.
Oh, my God, please, I need help. I've had a diner in the woods. There's a woman, I think she might be dead.
Okay, sir, please stay calm. Are you able to talk right now? Are you safe?
Jack's breath quickened with panic, and he forced it down his throat.
I think so. I'm not sure. I found her out here. She's been stabbed in the stomach with a broom handle. Oh, fuck. She's pregnant, too. It's right through her stomach.
Okay, sir. Where are you?
We're at Sinipia Diner.
Jack fumbled the name again. He was fighting to keep his breath manageable enough to keep speaking.
Police and first responders are on their way, sir. Are you with the woman now?
Yes.
Okay, sir. I'm going to need you to check her vitals. I can walk you through first aid. If she's still alive, we may be able to stabilize her. Are you able to try that?
Oh, God. Yes, I can. Okay. What do I do?
Jack clenched his eyes shut and turned back toward Prim. He opened them again. He had to try to help. He had to.
Okay. I want you to take your index finger and middle finger and press them against the side of her throat, just under her chin. Press them firmly and feel for a pulse, okay?
Jack lifted a shaking hand and reached towards Prim. Her hair hung in the way. He would have to push it aside to get at her neck. As he did so, he could see her hands were wrapped around the handle, tight against her stomach. Her knuckles were white with tension. He caught just a glimpse of her face. There were tears running down her cheeks. Her eyes were open but unmoving. Her mouth was frozen in a slight grin. Jack felt his own tears swelling as he pressed his fingers against her neck.
Okay.
What do you feel?
The tears overflowed and fell from his eyes.
Nothing.
No, son. Not that. What do you feel?
I don't feel anything.
Jack whimpered.
No pulse.
No. What do you feel?
I'm sorry. I don't feel anything. No pulse. I don't... Oh, God. She's starting to get cold.
The old woman's voice was gone. In its place, a deeper, masculine tone came through.
You did this.
Jack's heart shriveled in his chest so tightly it hurt. The tears were flowing freely now, and he could hear his own voice breaking.
What? What do you mean?
You did this.
No. I just found her like this, I swear. Please.
You did this.
No, I swear she was just...
You know you do.
Please. No, please, just send help, please.
Every word out of Jack's mouth was racked with faulty breaths. What did you order? Jack's blood froze. His throat seized, and the hands that had been feeling for a pulse released the pressure on Prim's neck.
What?
Flapjacks or eggs? Jack was stunned into silence. You wanted this. The voice spoke again.
No, please. I don't understand.
You never did. The phone clicked as the line went dead. The hum of a dial tone buzzed in Jack's ear. Jack stood like that for a long time. It wasn't quite shock. It was something else. His brain couldn't think. It wouldn't. Thinking would only lead somewhere much worse. Jack's eyes fell to the ground. They were drawn to the pad of paper. Jack could feel the tears clinging to his chin. He could hear the racking sobs his body was making, but the sound was muffled, like it was coming from a few rooms over. On the front side were 2 boxes, with a word written next to each. The first box read, head. The second, stomach. The second box had a check mark in it. From behind him, Jack heard a distant metallic pop, followed by a shrill whooshing noise, like a model rocket going off. He spun, dropping the pad as his heart pushed against his ribcage in fear. Back toward the diner, Jack could see the doorway he'd exited through. A heavy orange glow was reaching through it, spilling onto the step and grass below. It flickered violently along the earth. A thick column of black smoke floated through the top of the doorframe, visible only against the neon lights of the diner, before blending into the black night sky above. Fuck! 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 Jack cursed and took off toward the building. His adrenaline had kicked in and was giving him some much-needed relief from confronting what he'd just seen. As he closed the distance, Jack could see just how bright the interior was burning. The occasional lick of flame could be seen shooting out the window. Jack made it up to the steps and had to shield his face with his arm. The heat was punishing, but he forced his eyes open. The kitchen was ablaze. The flames had engulfed the stovetop and a majority of the counters. Fire shot through the opening to the dining area. Small order slips that had been left hanging were burnt to cinders. Jack turned for the fire extinguisher he'd left next to the door. Nothing there. The smoke got thicker and the fire moved further into the kitchen. He coughed and scanned the linoleum floor. Where had it gone? He was sure he'd left it right at the base of the door when he'd walked into the woods. His skin was getting far too hot, on the verge of burning. The heat was like a wall pushing him back. He took a step back down onto the ground outside. Just as he went to turn to gasp for air, he saw it. The fire extinguisher was lying under a metal table. It was bent inwards violently. The triggering mechanism on the top was broken. It looked like a crushed soda can with something punctured through its center. Jack squinted, his eyes filling with tears against the ever-increasing temperature. Whatever it was jagged and dirty. It looked almost like a branch, with its end splintered. The shape. An antler. Jack nearly fell backwards. He turned, gasping in the clean air, and sprinted around the side of the building. His body was moving on its own, but his eyes were darting everywhere, across the tree line, toward the road, through the windows to the inferno inside. He heaved air in and out of his lungs. The car. Prim's car was out front. Get to the car. He turned the corner and stumbled into the parking space in front of the diner. The heat emanating from the windows next to him was immediately overshadowed by the tidal wave of burning air that the car was giving off. The car was engulfed in flame. Fire was shooting through the windows and slipping through the front of the hood. It was too much. Jack hadn't had the time to parse anything that had happened in the past 30 seconds. Sensations and experiences were piling up in his mind and pushing his rationality to its limit. Reason couldn't churn through the thoughts fast enough to make any decisions. The car was on fire. Something clicked in his head. Jack nearly fell over himself as he took off toward the street. He just stepped onto the asphalt when the gas tank exploded behind him, erupting in an immensely painful noise. The force slammed into Jack's back and flung him across the street. His head bounced against the hard pavement. Senses blurred as he lost consciousness. Part 3. There were bottles. Some of them were half empty, others had been broken against the bed frame. The liquor pooled and sunk into the crevices between the wooden floorboards. It spread slowly with a slant to the floor, curving around the bedposts. The bits of glass refracted whatever light bounced off the liquid, creating tiny, pearlescent shines across a sea of booze. It looked kind of like a night sky, he thought. His head hurt. Why did his head hurt? Maybe he could be a spaceman. Drift off into those shiny stars through the sea of the universe, and things would be quiet. His head wouldn't hurt.
I can do whatever I goddamn need to do, you pig fuck.
The voice was loud, but far away. It was subdued by layers of walls and fog in my mind, but the sound still had a sharpness to it. The sharpness nicked him, and Jack grimaced. He was floating in the sea. It shouldn't be sharp here.
What am I supposed to say when people start asking? You just need to take everything down with you? Is that it? You'd rather ruin everything for us than man up for once.
The female voice was calmer, more controlled, but just as loud. A hatred most precise floated just behind its words, in contrast to the tolerance of malice the male voice failed to hide. Jack felt like he was bleeding, but he wasn't. It was silly. If he was bleeding, the liquid on the floor would be red.
You don't get to ask me that!
Glass broke somewhere. It wasn't in the sea where Jack was, though. He didn't want to break any more glass. Besides, he only had the one bottle left. Jack drifted out of his little sea, and the voices from downstairs came back into focus. He looked to his left. Shit! He'd lost track of his arm and was holding the bottle lazily on its side. Most of the amber liquid had poured out onto the floor, creating a new puddle that was just now meeting the one he'd been floating in. He needed to get another. With some effort, Jack pushed himself forward and off the bed. Landing on his feet caused his head to rush. And for a moment, he held his arms out to steady himself, scraping his knuckles across the rough wood of the bed frame. His vision blurred at its edges and focused solely on the scratched wood door across the room. Just had to be quick. They wouldn't notice if he was quick. Jack's arms were cold. Not freezing, but just on the edge of sending shivers through his body. The next sensation that came back to him was pain in his cheek. The minuscule canyons and valleys of the cracked asphalt pressed into his skin with all the weight of his head behind it. There would almost certainly be an imprint left on his face. He lifted his chin off the ground, and instinctively his eyes blinked the awareness back into them. Jack wiped at his eyes, rubbing away the mix of sleep and tears that had accumulated there. He was on his stomach. The night was quiet. Trees stood in silent judgment ahead of him, just beyond the entrance of the road. The mist remained, but it seemed thicker, closer, more precise. The individual trunks of the trees even blurred together a bit in its refraction. Where was he? Propping himself up with his right arm, Jack rolled over. All at once, he was reminded of what happened as his back scraped along the pavement.
Ow! Fuck! Shit! Ow! Ow! Ow!
Jack sat up quickly and cradled his side with his arm. The pain along his back had been immediate. It had ripped through his nerve endings as soon as he touched the pavement. He craned his neck, but couldn't get a good angle to see what was wrong. To his pleasant surprise, the thickness of the mist and fog was providing some immediate relief. The wet air that hung around him was quickly draining his body heat, but also soothing the pain in his back, like cold tap water over a burn from the stove. Jack let go of his side and looked back at the diner. It was dark. A section of the roof had collapsed in. Shattered glass lay strewn across the parking lot. The neon green lights that had made up the trim above the windows was no longer lit. He could see some of the tube bulbs that it had been comprised of were shattered. Huge areas of the walls and interior were charred black where the fire had passed over. The only source of light that remained was the eerie green glow of the diner's sign up on its pole. It was a bit away from the building itself, but the fire seemed to have reached its base, as the bottom 10 or so feet of the pole was also charred black. The diner lettering had fully gone out, leaving just Sinepia. The neon tubes flickered their sickly light as whatever wiring remained tried to maintain current through the damage. Jack's gaze fell back to the parking lot, where he saw the car that had sent him flying. The rear left side was in tatters. Pieces of tire rubber were strewn across the asphalt, and some had flown as far as the grass of the tree line. Shards of the bent metal curved outward where the trunk and back door had been. The seats were a deep charcoal black. Their leather had dried out and cracked in the heat. His brain tried to sort out what could have happened. He used the fire extinguisher to put out the stove top where his eggs were burning. He was sure of it. And even if he hadn't fully put it out, there's no way the fire could have spread fast enough to become what it did. Never mind the fact that the car, which wasn't even in the building, was also burning. With a painful effort, Jack steadied himself on his arm and stood up, first onto one knee, then both feet. How long had he been unconscious? The diner was completely dark and entirely quiet. The fire was gone. No smoke, no embers. Nothing. He took a few shaky steps toward the building, which turned into a cautious and controlled walk as his legs came back to life. He gave the car wreck a wide berth as he passed it, and came up to one of the few glass windows of the diner that wasn't shattered nor coated in ash. He could make out his half-reflection in the transparent pane, illuminated occasionally by the fickle green lights of the sign behind him. The pavement had indeed left an imprint on his cheek while he'd been lying there. His temple had also received a nasty cut from the impact just above his eye. Blood had poured down the curves of his face and narrowly avoided his eye, but the whole trail had dried at this point. Jack turned halfway and looked over his shoulder, grimacing in pain as he did so. The sweater he had on was torn all along his back. The brownish-maroon threads that Penny had spent so many hours interweaving had ripped and unraveled. The shirt beneath had been similarly blown away, leaving the majority of his bare back exposed. Jack sucked in breath as he assessed the damage. His skin was blistered and burned in multiple places. From the base of his spine all the way up his right side, the skin was rippled and discolored. Some parts were simply red. Others had the pockmarks of a sausage left too long over a campfire. Dried blood ran all along the creases created by the curdled skin. In the green light, the coloration and shadows gave his injuries an inhuman look, like something out of a zombie movie. The shoulder blades had gotten the worst of it. As he forced himself to look closer, Jack could see small speckles sprinkled across the burned flesh that caught the light and glimmered it back at him. Glass and metal. Jack wanted to throw up again. The car had exploded into his back, burrowing tiny pellets of debris into him like a shotgun. His stomach heaved, but nothing came up. He looked away. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, the persistent pressure on his ribs, the unnaturally light feeling his lungs took on as his breathing sped up. He slammed his eyes shut and tried to take deep breaths. What the fuck? What the fuck was happening? For a moment he thought he'd lost it and was about to collapse, but just at the brink, his heart started to slow and his breathing relaxed. He needed a drink. How was he not in more pain? Jack thought. That answer came to him immediately. Adrenaline. That had to be it. His body wasn't letting him feel anything. Jack wondered how long it could keep that up. He didn't want to know what it would feel like. At the same time, Jack could feel the chemical sedative wearing off, and the pain was taking up more and more of his perception. Or maybe he was only imagining that, because he just thought of it. What was that called? Placebo. Jack turned away from the glass and stepped toward the road. He didn't want to look at the damage anymore. Even knowing the gruesome reflection of his back was behind him felt like there was a monster waiting just over his shoulder. He hobbled back out into the road, wincing with each footfall. Even slight movements moved the skin on his back enough to agitate the shrapnel. Jack felt his right pocket and was relieved to feel the familiar shape of a phone. He pulled it out. It was Prim's. The screen had shattered on impact with the pavement. It refused to turn on. Hurriedly, Jack let it fall to the pavement and went digging in his other pocket. He found his phone and steeled himself for disappointment. This one had survived. The screen lit up as he turned it over in his hand. 3:10 a.m. 5% battery remaining. Jack's brow furrowed as he read the screen. That didn't make any sense. He'd checked the time just before he found the diner, and it had been later than that. 4 or 5 a.m. or something. Oh, shit. Jack swiped open the phone. He knew he was using precious battery power keeping the screen lit more than it needed to be, but he had to check. The homepage of his off-brand Android had a detailed date and time display that read 3:10 a.m., Tuesday, November 18th. Jack stared at the screen for a good while before coming to terms with what he was reading. He turned the phone off again to conserve power and slid it into his right pocket. It was Tuesday. He'd left for the airport on Monday morning. He'd been lying on that road for almost 24 hours. Jack tried to rationalize it. The length of time he'd been unconscious wasn't the problem. Hell, he'd taken a bad hit to the head. He was lucky he'd woken up at all. No. What bothered him was that no one had seen him there through the course of an entire day. He was on a back road, sure, but this was right out front of a diner. This place must get some traffic to stay in business. Never mind that he couldn't have been that far from the interstate he'd gotten off of the night before. There's no way in hell that not a single person came down this road over the course of a day. It wasn't like they could have missed him. He had been sprawled out across the dotted yellow line. That's not something you overlook. Jack's thoughts were interrupted as a sting of pain flared up from his back, forcing him to clench his teeth. He didn't get a chance to continue pondering how long he'd laid unconscious in front of that diner, as the slightest change in light pierced Jack's peripheral vision. He turned from the way he'd come and looked down the other side of the road. There was still a rapid decline in visibility from the fog, but as he focused and made sense of the way the light played against it, he could see the way it implied there was a light source coming from down the road. Jack carefully looked back over his shoulder, swapping his focus between the way he'd come and what was left of the diner. Something set that fire. Something had to have. Something that let him lay here helpless and unconscious for hours. The thought somehow made the scene even more unnerving to Jack. What if it was still here? Suddenly, it seemed like every shadow had something he was obscuring. Every tree had something out of sight just behind it. He inhaled a short breath to prepare for the pain it would bring, then turned back and started taking slow, cautious steps toward the light from the fog to get a better look. Every few steps, he would stop, take a deep breath, and grit his teeth through the discomfort of turning to make sure the diner was still visible. He decided he didn't believe in placebo. The adrenaline was definitely draining. This shit was hurting more and more every step. After about 30 feet, the light bouncing around the fog had begun to focus. While it still smeared across the mist, it was much clearer than before. Two focused beams of white light far off, spreading out toward him. Headlights. Jack's chest fluttered. His fight or flight was still very active, but the promise of hope took precedence in his decision-making. His pace picked up, a powerful impatience finding its way into each step. The pain flared in his back with a change of speed, but it was suddenly much easier to ignore.
Hey, over here. Please, oh God, there's been a fire, and...
Jack's voice caught in his throat as he fully remembered Prim, her body floating like a marionette on the shattered broom handle.
Please, hey.
The headlights were getting closer now, their shapes clearer with each step.
I need help. I'm hurt bad.
Jack's voice trailed off as the space around the light source revealed its definition. The passenger side headlight wasn't quite right. Now that he was closer, he could see its angle was a bit bent, and the beam it projected was misshapen compared to the other. His steps continued, though without their previous enthusiasm. The fog suddenly receded in a step, and Jack found himself raising his hand to cover his eyes. The unbroken shine was hitting him directly in the eyes, and without the shield of the mist, his eyes couldn't focus quick enough. He sidestepped around the blinding beam, his eyes blinking into focus. Without it incapacitating him, the glow shedding off the headlights allowed him to finally get a clear picture of the scene before him. There was a massive tree, a great, massive one. The thick trunk jutted out from the earth at the bottom of a steep hill, unmoving. Partially wrapped around its bark was a grisly-looking car wreck. The silver sedan's passenger side had collided with the behemoth head-on. One headlight and the hood were almost comically bent around its circumference. The tire and wheel well sprawled out of their normal placement at harsh angles. The car was still running. The chugging of the engine could be heard, and a dim yellow interior light was on in the cab. This wasn't what immediately caught Jack's attention, however. No. What Jack couldn't stop looking at was what sat in front of the tree. The road ended right before the base of the hill and forked, extending off in either direction. The sedan seemed to have come barreling down the hill from above. Standing silently between the street and the car-wrapped tree was a sign, a large yellow street sign with a double-ended black arrow pointing off into the fog. Jack stood still for some time. He was afraid to move, to make any sound. The sign just sat there, its yellow color unnatural against the dark greens and grays of the forest. The headlights behind caught its edges and cast an immense shadow down across the pavement. The only sound in the whole forest was the hum of the car's engine. It followed a slight pattern. Chug, chug, chugga, chug, chug, chugga, like a heartbeat. Jack could have sworn his own heartbeat was straining to match the car's. The sign stood, staring down at him. Fear was back in full force, and the pain of his back was pushed to the bottom of his senses priority list in favor of keen hearing and sight. Slowly, Jack stepped out and around the scene, never taking his eyes off the street sign. As he looped around, he took a couple paces off the road and up to the earthen hill. He forcefully and carefully turned his gaze to the driver's side door of the car. There was no one inside. The windshield had been obliterated. Tiny shards of broken glass were littered all across the dash and front seats. There were other shards of glass, though, some with different tints. A familiar smell hit his nose, and he immediately knew where the outlier pieces had come from. Strewn about the cabin were empty bottles of liquor, some half-shattered, some intact. Something itched in Jack's brain. His tongue was dry and his throat wouldn't let air through. He didn't want to take another sip, or the passenger side would come into view. He knew he didn't want to see the passenger side. He knew what was there. Jack's feet moved despite his pleading. The seat came into view, malformed and bent around the trunk of the tree it was interlocked with. A low-hanging branch of the tree had punctured the passenger's side windshield. The branch was massively thick at the base, as wide as trunks of similar trees. It came to a series of ragged points quickly, however, like it had been struck off by lightning. Its furthest tip just reached the chest level of the car seat. Both the branch and seat were coated in a deep red liquid. It looked like the tree was reaching into the vehicle, its limb outstretched and covered in blood, like some woodland demon grasping for something just out of reach. From the splintered tips of the branch, the beginnings of reddish-pink flowers were blooming. Jack stared in horror. There was no one in the seat, no one on the branch. There was supposed to be someone on the branch. He heaved again, but nothing came up. He watched as a small droplet of blood on the branch pooled at the end of one of its many prongs and fell onto the muddied leather. He nearly fell backwards as he turned from the wreck, landing on one knee in the wet grass. He thought, or he tried to. This didn't make sense. None of this had made sense, but this was something else. It should be something he could comprehend, but he couldn't. Then, Jack heard it. Just over the chugging of the car's engine, he made out a familiar noise. It was faint, but clear, and coming from down the right side of the fork in the road. It rose and waned in intensity and regular intervals. The familiar whine faded in and out. Jack grasped onto the sound and gripped it with all his mental intent. He normally despised the sounds of ambulances, but the understandability of such a commonplace sound was like a drug in his current state. He started pulling some pieces together in his mind. If there was an ambulance here, there was a reason they were here. They must have just come from this crash. They were probably driving the passengers to the hospital right now. They were getting away. Without even completing his thoughts, Jack shoved his fists against the ground and fell forward into a manic run.
No, please, wait, hey, wait.
His voice was hoarse, and he coughed out the words. He realized he had been holding his breath since the sign had come into view. In a second, he was back onto the street, the pain in his body fully numb, and he broke into a full sprint down the road.
Stop, you have to stop, please.
The siren sound got louder and clearer. It faded and returned at a regular interval, like it was one of those old-school spinning tornado alarms. The fluctuation of volume helped Jack hone in on distance and direction. He was gaining. Somewhere in his mind he knew that didn't make any sense. Unless they heard him. Maybe they were actually stopping. Jack ran and ran until the sound of the ambulance was right on him. He was almost there. He kept going, and his heart sank as the sound began to fade.
No, what?
Jack coughed and nearly fell. His lungs were burning. His legs weren't ready for an extended sprint after spending an entire day unused. He caught his weight on the ball of his foot, nearly twisting his ankle and regaining his balance. Just as he began to push off again to keep up the chase, he stopped. He focused on the siren. its oscillation made pinpointing the direction much easier. It was behind him. Jack turned, holding his chest as he wheezed for air. He started back in the direction he'd come, and sure enough, the sound grew louder. Soon it was back, too, as loud as it had been. However, when he kept backtracking, he heard it begin to fade again. Confused, exhausted, and delirious, Jack hobbled back toward the peak of the sound. His body had given him another burst of adrenaline for this chase, but it was clear that they were getting less effective every time. The pain was back, and bad. He could feel warm streams of fresh blood running down his lower back. The run must have reopened partially healed burns and wounds. Jack looked up and down the street, but didn't see anything. No light, no cars, just trees and the hill to his left. The sound was clear as day, right on top of him. With a deep breath, Jack closed his eyes and listened. It was coming from up the hill. He opened his eyes and looked down it. 1 foot at a time, he stepped off the road and started a slow climb. Sure enough, with every step, the siren grew louder. That's it, Jack, he thought. Just find the ambulance. Just keep going. Don't think about the car, the diner, and the branch, and just find the ambulance. The trek up was agonizing. He could push the pain back further into his consciousness, but occasionally a foot would slip or catch a root, causing him to tense to maintain balance, and pushing shrapnel deeper into the burned skin on his back. The incline of the hill grew steeper and steeper as he reached the top. Soon, Jack was doing more climbing than walking up the hill, using all fours for stability. Eventually, a few feet above his head, Jack could see a crest that vanished out of sight. The ambulance siren was louder than ever now, and clearly coming from just over the bend. Jack dug his knee into the ground and heaved his head up over the precipice, grabbing a tuft of grass from the top as support. The hill did, in fact, level off. The thin tree coverage that had been Jack's faithful companion during his ascent tapered off over the edge as well. Stretched in front of him was a largely barren clearing in the otherwise dense woods. It was ovular, stretching out further ahead of him than to his left or right. The ground didn't have the same characteristic brownish-green coloring of fallen leaves like the rest of the forest. No, in place of stray twigs and ferns was long grass. It was a ghostly green color, reflecting more of what little illumination the moon provided. The reflection paired with the lack of tree coverage made the whole field seem to glow when compared to the dark forest that encompassed it. Peculiarly, the long grass was not upright, but rather every blade was laid gently on its side. All the grass in a given area was stretched in the same direction, toward the middle of the clearing. If you were to walk the circumference, you would see the grass's angle slowly but surely rotate with you to ensure it was always pointing you back to its center. The smoothness and uniformity of it all made the grass look almost like silk, internally placed into a large pattern. The siren sound of the ambulance was everywhere now. Jack could feel it in his body, the same way you could feel reverberations in your bones at a concert. But there was no ambulance. No, the sound was coming from the center of the clearing. Directly in the middle of the field, maybe 40 or so feet from Jack, stood a sign, terribly familiar. The large yellow diamond shape was supported by 2 metal posts and had the same imposing double-sided black arrow painted across its face. The cold, industrial look of the street sign was only made more unsettling by the fact that it was firmly situated far away from any road. It stood in defiance of the greenery around it. Pinned to the front of the sign and partially covering the arrow was a deer. No, Jack realized. The deer. What blood was left in the carcass had dripped out its multiple wounds and stained the bottom of the sign red. The animal's head hung lazily down over its chest. The same dried and exposed section of bone and skin was still there. Only a stump remained of what had once been a healthy antler. The animal's front legs were bent in an unnatural position. The beast's back was up against the sign, with its underside facing out toward Jack. Its front legs had been forced straight out in either direction, like a man spreading his arms for a hug. Whatever had forced the legs out like that had completely destroyed its shoulder joints. Bone had clearly broken, and the right shoulder's skin had even torn, showing a mix of grey and pink and white flesh and bone. The ball fully removed from its intended socket. The back legs were not as forcefully bent, but angled slightly inward so that the feet overlapped below the rest of the deer near the bottom corner of the sign. Jack recognized the shape. The deer had been pinned to the road sign in a mock crucifixion. He could see the back hooves had something run through them, pinning them to the sheet metal. Each front hoof was also punctured and held against the signage, with one positioned in each head of the dual-sided arrow. This alone would have been enough to leave Jack nonverbal with fear and disquiet. But there was something else. Standing a few feet to the side of the sign crucifixion, just obscured enough that he'd overlooked it, was a figure. Its back was to him, was what looked like a young girl. From her size, she couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. She wore an old, worn sundress. The colors had long since faded into a mix of grays and blacks, and it was adorned with a pattern of flowers smudged in dirt and muck. Whatever this thing was, its similarity to a child ended at the shoulders. There was no neck, no head. In their place, a wooden pole a foot or so long extended straight up, out of her clavicle. Wrapped around the post were thick, black cords. They looked rubber, like the casing on power lines. Where they met with the body, they flowed directly into the flesh. They were haphazardly placed. Some entered the shoulders, others the back. Near the top of the pole, all the wires converged to a small, black box that slowly spun a siren horn atop it. Jack stared. His eyes had just barely peeked over the precipice. His body was hung in a sort of mid-pull-up position, his knuckles white from the effort of gripping the earth he used for leverage. But Jack did not dare move. He didn't breathe. He just stared, mortified, as the siren spun on top of the body of a child. As it swung toward him, Jack felt the intensity of the ambulance sound increase. The rotors of the machine swung the head back around, and as it circled, the sound died off ever so slightly with the change in direction. There is only so much a person can see and effectively process. If enough pressure is exerted over a short enough period of time and in foreign enough circumstances, we all revert to a spectator. Jack felt as such, like he was watching from deep inside his body. We operate in a world we think we largely understand, one of blacks and whites. How would you expect someone living in a monochrome universe to react to the color red? Scream in willful confusion, stare in reverent fear. Why expect any more from us? The girl was walking toward the deer. Jack could see that with each step it took, the flattened grass at its feet would change. From the soil beneath, deep, brownish maroon roots would spring up. They interlocked and wove together in braids, following in the footsteps of where the girl had been. Once they slowed, each root sprouted tiny little branches that bloomed bright pink and red flowers. Each flower's petals curved as they spread out from a recessed yellow center. As she walked, the girl's siren continued to spin, the same ambulance wail emanating from it. She stopped just in front of the deer. Jack's grip on the ground had dug too deep into the dirt at this point. He could feel whatever series of roots and connective tissue the dirt had been relying on for support start to rip under all the weight he was putting on it. Slowly and carefully, he lifted his other hand to spread the weight across the ledge.
With far too much tension, he lifted his leg and attempted to silently bury it into the ground of the hill he was poised to relieve some of the stress. The girl stood in front of the deer for a few seconds, unmoving. After a moment, Jack noticed motion along the ground. Shifting his eyes, he could see the interwinding roots that followed behind were now moving ahead. They burrowed in and out of the ground until they reached the metal posts holding up the sign. They began spiraling around and around it, splitting off like vines climbing a garden arbor. As they reached the yellow metal, they continued up along the face of it. The roots dug into the metal and punctured through, only to pierce back out again from the backside soon after, much like they had with the ground below. Eventually, the vines diverged, splitting into countless smaller strands like wooden fingers slithering along and through the metal. As each one met with the flesh of the deer, they did not slow. The roots burrowed in with no effort and began snaking in and out of the meat, twisting the skin around as they braided and unbraided with one another. The deer was punctured and skewered in countless places as the roots spread through it like they were searching the earth for their life-saving water. Out from the deer's stomach came two large vines. They reached out and met with the deer's lopsided head, lifting its chin up to look ahead. The roots slowed and eventually became still. Only then did they start blooming the same deep pink flowers all across the animal, making a bizarre and grotesque display of color against the matted, rotting fur. Jack watched in discontented rapture. The rusted metal alarm atop the girl's body continued to spin, spreading its siren sound through the trees around him. The girl still stood in front of the now root-riddled carcass. She raised her left arm, grasping the deer's remaining antler. Her fingers looked ill-equipped for the job. The child's hand and short fingers struggled to wrap even halfway around the full-grown deer's thick, channeled bone. With one quick motion, the girl's hand twisted and shot downwards. The antler fractured along its base at the twist and came tearing off at a swing of the arm. The strength of the bone contested as long as it could, causing the vines that had lifted the deer's chin to push against the head's downward pressure and puncture through its mandible, extruding the tiniest bit of root through the top of its decaying snout. Jack's phone. It was ringing loudly. Part 4. The girl's siren swung fast, faster than it had ever moved before. It stopped all at once as it came in line with where Jack hung. The ambulance wailing grew louder. Even as the sound waves from the horn reached Jack's ears, he could see her body start to twist back around towards him. Jack screamed a horrible scream, the kind of scream he'd only heard in the movies. His hands released the ledge that supported him, and his legs attempted to twist and catch his fall. As the inclining earth of the hill beneath him rapidly approached, his reflexes provided too slow. His legs caught the ground under him, and he was sent into a roll down the hill. Somewhere, his brain cataloged a sharp pain in his ankle as his foot took the weight of his body on its side. Jack rolled and bucked against the ground, and exposed roots caught him in the rib, knocking the wind out of his lungs. Before he had the time to notice his stolen breath, a rock ripped across his flailing shoulder, drawing blood as his head bounced off the ground. Softer than pavement, but still hard enough to fill his vision with dark, disorienting bubbles. The phone still rang, vibrating in his left pocket. The hill's angle quickly began its return to level, and with it, Jack's uncontrolled fall slowed significantly thanks to a hard collision with a crooked tree trunk, at the expense of his other shoulder's integrity. Pain was pounding on the doors of his awareness, demanding to be let in despite the adrenaline's protests. His arms and legs shoved against the ground and began to turn him to his feet, racing down the still steep hill, now on all fours, then up to his feet, only to fall back onto his hands hard. As he did his best to run rather than roll, he heard the distant sound of the ambulance behind him. All at once, its intensity skyrocketed, as he could only assume the girl had reached the ledge and was looking over, or maybe had already followed him down. It didn't matter. He wasn't looking back. He was sprinting, crawling, stumbling, falling, hurtling down the hill.
Jack reached the bottom at a speed he would later recognize as far too overzealous. His feet caught him hard against the unyielding pavement of the road. A shock of lightning shot up his brain from his injured ankle, blowing past his chemical defenses and demanding to make itself known. Jack's sprint didn't stop, but he could feel a sharp stab of pain with each footfall. He ran directly away from the sounds of the sirens behind him, across the road and into the forest beyond. The trees grew thicker, and for once the walls of woods felt somewhat comforting. He dodged between trunks as he went, each thick wooden sentinel helping to drown out the shrieking alarm behind him. Slowly but surely, the sound grew muted, then quiet, then silent. That didn't matter. Jack didn't stop running. He wouldn't stop running. Multiple times a rogue root or rock caught his legs and sent him toppling, but even before he hit the ground, he was scrambling back up to a sprint with his hands and knees. What the fuck? What the fuck was that? What the fuck was going on? There was no room for explanations left in Jack's mind. The time for half-baked excuses and frail interpretations meant to placate his rapidly deteriorating sense of reality was long past. Even willful ignorance now refused his summons as he found himself sprinting through the woods, unable to do anything but beg himself for answers. Strangely, as he ran, Jack found himself thinking about the ambulance siren that had lured him up that hill. He'd always hated the sound of ambulances. They were a sound uniquely designed to demand attention. The siren itself was invasive, yes, but what leadened Jack's feet so much upon hearing it wasn't the sound, but the implication of disaster it carried. He could be driving, walking, talking, minding his own business, and all it would take was a single rising tone from one passing by to slow his walk, dry his mouth, and scratch at his throat. The alarm made an undeniable and unignorable promise to every single person who heard it that a tragedy had occurred. No matter how good of a day one was having, no matter how much life was looking up or things were getting better, everyone was one single unprovoked sound away from being reminded that they were, without a moment's reprieve, surrounded by disaster, catastrophe, and misfortune. There was no choice to be had. No opting out to the announcement. Just around the corner was another person's worst moment. It was an unwelcome reminder of the reality of pain, and an unavoidable promise that one day the same alarm bells would be rung for you. Jack hated the sound of ambulances. His mind was suddenly invaded with the image of the car wreck he'd seen just before hearing the siren. The sickly wet blood soaking into the sharp branch. Jack imagined himself skewered on that branch. He imagined Penn. His mental state felt fractured. Somehow all those thoughts were passing through his mind. Emotional and distressing thoughts, yes, but analytical and intentional. Simultaneously, another part of his mind was in a frenzied manic rush. His sprinting had not given up, for fear of turning around to see something else impossible, some new, violent hue of color breaking into his monochrome world. His blood pumped and his muscles ached against their own fatigue as his lungs seized with short, fast gasps of air. The dissonance of instinct and thought left his perception dizzied. How long had he been running? His shoulder bled from where he'd encountered that rock during his fall. His back was torn apart even further than before, fresh blood and pus running down his hamstrings. His ankle screamed up at him with each step, and his other shoulder had visibly swollen from internal bleeding. Still, he swore he could feel the siren behind him, just on the edge of audibility, like a shadow announcing the arrival of something new into your field of view. He feared if he stopped, it would once again reach his eardrums, obscure, but getting clearer. It was just as Jack was beginning to feel lightheaded again that he dodged around a tree and found himself in another large clearing in the otherwise densely packed woods. This opening was far larger than the one up the hill. It stretched out for 100 or so feet in an odd twisted shape before relenting back to the tree line. The grass was short and did not lay in any distinct pattern. In the middle of the clearing stood a building, old, dirtied, and abandoned. It had strange sections jutting off in every direction. They all connected to a central structure, a long edifice with tall, pointed, and disorderly boarded-up windows along its walls. The roof came to an end at a huge pointed steeple with an old metal cross affixed at its peak. A church. All this came into view the second Jack broke the tree line. As his feet came into contact with the grass of the clearing, his body continued its unyielding advance. The distance closed between him and the dilapidated building as he ran. The cognizant part of his mind caused him to steal a look behind. The trees he'd left swallowed up what little moonlight there was and offered no indication of movement nor sound. He didn't trust his senses. Turning back toward the church, he quickly came upon an old, semi-rotted doorframe. The door connected to one of the many randomly placed additions that had been tacked onto the church's original cathedral. The door lay lopsided within its frame. The wood was dark, likely originally a shade closer to brown than black, but time and neglect had weathered its edges and let the dark of the forest around it sink into its grain. Jack came to a careless stop, nearly slamming into the shingling surrounding the doorframe. He frantically grabbed at the handle. The door shook at his impact, but the aged latch still completed its function and kept the door in place. With some effort, Jack twisted the handle. At first, it protested, but then whatever rust and grime had held it in place gave way, and the handle turned, the latch released, and the door swung inward. Jack stumbled in and quickly closed it behind him. The interior was significantly darker than outside. Jack pressed against the door to wait for his eyes to adjust. As he did so, he winced and instantly regretted it. His charred and cut-up back reminding him not so politely of its current state. The room came into a musty and shadowed focus. Small slits and breaks in the roof and walls allowed tiny amounts of moonlight in, just enough information reflected to keep Jack's eyes hard at work, attempting to make it out. The room was small. A stained wooden desk sat against the far wall, with papers scattered over the top, and multiple cups turned on their side, their contents having been absorbed by the wood or dried in place long ago. To its right, a door to the rest of the building stood. This one was also closed, but in a much better state than its exterior counterpart. Shelves with rows of tomes and mugs covered what walls were still sound enough to hold their weight. Those that weren't as lucky had collapsed onto the floor, sending their cargo across the floor. Jack made for the desk and nearly collapsed behind it, tucking into the cavity intended for the user's legs. He gripped his legs to his chin and only then realized he'd been crying, as the tears that had pooled in the creases of his panting face spilled onto his kneecaps. Fuck. Why was any of this happening? Why had he just frozen and watched that thing? Why didn't he just turn around the second he saw it? He'd lost all sense of himself when he'd seen it. And then his phone had rung. Jack hastily unraveled himself and dug into his jeans. His shoulders stung as he pressed them backwards to reach down in his position. Not finding it in his left pocket, he had to shift his weight and reach into the right. Pulling out a small device, he stared at its blank screen. It had been in his left pocket when it rang, hadn't it? Everything seemed quiet as he pressed the power button, and the light illuminated his face. One missed call from Ben. Jack's body racked as he let out an involuntary sob. He caught it in his throat, still not wanting to make any noise, but a strangled hack managed to escape as tears once again leaked down from his previously tried-out ducts. He unlocked the phone and quickly opened the notification, dialing the number and holding it up to his ear, cupping the microphone with his other hand to stifle any noise. The phone played the dial tone, then went silent again. Another stifling cry escaped Jack's mouth as he looked at the screen again. No servers. Call could not be completed. His mouth began to drool as he pressed his tongue against his grimaced teeth to keep his emotions in. He could feel his nose starting to burn, the tears dripping off his chin. His chest was expanding, not with breath, but with a painful heat. His pulse was charged, and his heart was beating dangerously fast. No, please, Ben, please. He mumbled into his clenched fist. He'd been so close to her. If she'd just called a few minutes earlier, or if he hadn't climbed the fucking hill, maybe he could have...
when Jack noticed the second notification hidden under the first. One new voicemail. His heart leapt in a mix of fear and hope. Carefully, he turned the volume to the lowest possible setting, then lifted the speaker to his ear and once again cupped it with the other hand. The sound crackled to life, and Penn's all too familiar and crushingly shaky voice reached Jack's ear.
Hi, Jack. Listen, I know you're probably in Idaho by now, but I didn't mean what I said the other night. I hope you didn't mean any of it either.
Jack fought against another racking sob, holding in most of the sound, but sending more snot and tears streaking down his face.
It was just seeing you like that. I should have expected it, I know, but we'd both been sober for almost a month. And that day was the first time I actually let myself think things might be different now. I know it's not a fair thing to put on you, and you just heard about your dad, and...
The recording went silent for a beat, and Jack's heart pounded.
I'm keeping the baby, Jack. I'm not going to force you to be a part of its life. It's your choice. But please, please, you have to know that you can be better than them. That you are better than them. I love you. I think.
Jack's face was a wet mess. His sobs were contained entirely in his chest, and the effort of stifling them caused him to convulse as they came, causing phlegm and spit and tears to mix in every crease of his face. The rapid stretches of his ribcage sent painful aches through his back as the muscles tensed and loosened around the debris still lodged within them. The hands that had been cupping the phone had given up its duty and now covered his mouth tightly, like holding it there would keep the sound from escaping.
I think I have to believe that you didn't mean what you said, because I didn't mean anything I said, and...
The recording went silent for a beat.
But please, if you did mean anything you said, don't call me back. Don't.
Jack could hear her voice breaking through the phone. The timing of her soft attempts to cut her crying short almost synced up with his own heaving spasms.
I'm so scared, Jack. I need you to know it might be unfair, but I'm so scared. I'm scared of this kid, and I'm scared that you're not who I thought you were, and I'm scared because I don't know how to help you, Jack. I can't stop thinking, would you have done it if I walked in on you the other night? Christ, what the fuck am I supposed to do? Was it my fault for telling you? Please, Jack,
Jack's eyes widened just a bit as the sound of Penn's voice tapered off, followed soon by the recording coming to an end. He pulled the phone back from his ear and looked at the screen. This was the end of the voicemail. The image of the screen stretched out wildly as the light was refracted through wells of tears in his eyes. The hand over his mouth was soaked in tears and mucus, and his teeth dug into each other with such force that he swore he could feel them cracking. The phone's screen shut off on its own. The battery was dead. Jack sobbed. His tears bled over his hands and sunk into the deep brownish-maroon threads of the sweater Penn had made him. They interlocked and wove together in braids, catching the mucus and runoff as he sunk his teeth into the fabric to suffocate the sound. He wished he could help her. He knew he couldn't. She had to know he couldn't. She had to. Not before. Especially not now. New pulses of pain were reaching his nervous system from the lacerations and bruises that covered his body. He was cold. So cold. And it was dark. So dark in the tiny church office he'd made his refuge from the unfathomable. He thought about a good many things while he sat curled up under that crusted wooden desk. His mind scrambled between thoughts of Penelope, the dual arrow road sign, his mom and dad, the deer with its broken antler, his future son or daughter, the throbbing of his back, and that horrible thing in the woods with a little girl's body. And overlaying all these images in his mind like a transparent curtain was the thought of a drink. God, how he needed a drink. Every aspect of his mind and his body demanded it of him. His hands shook with a chemical pleading. Eventually, Jack's sobbing stopped. Not for the lack of need, but rather his body simply stopped providing him with the luxury of emoting. He was far too busy fighting microscopic battles against his other injuries. He found himself simply sitting, eyes wide, head pulled to his knees and arms wrapped around them. At some point, he slid his phone back into his right pocket. He had to find a way out of this. He had to stay awake, stay conscious until the sun came back up, then maybe find the road again. He recognized the futility of the thought, even as he clung to it. At some point, he would have to face the reality of what he'd seen. Did he really believe that something as inconsequential and irreverent as daylight would make the woods that surrounded him hospitable again? In what fantasy was he living that a change in brightness would make that girl in the sundress bearable? If anything, seeing it without the comforting obstruction of darkness would only make it harder to deny. It was in this state of frozen contemplation that a sound first reached Jack's ears. His body tightened with fear as his brain realized something other than him was within earshot, but it also kick-started his senses, making the noise a bit clearer. Somewhere, muffled through walls and distance, was someone speaking. The words were intelligible, but the cadence and emphasis of the frequency matched a person's intentional enunciation. Very carefully, Jack leaned his head out from under the desk and turned. The sound was coming from deeper within the church, through the door in the other end of the office. A door that his now fully adjusted eyes could see was slightly ajar. As quietly as possible, Jack turned onto all fours, forcing the jolts of pain in his shoulders, back, and ankle down into his subconscious, and made his way to the door. The sound was clearer here, an unmistakable pattern of human speech, and fervorous speech at that. Jack's heart had begun to pick up its pace again, and his skin felt riddled with an anxious dread. He didn't believe for a second that what he heard was what it seemed. Yet, be it his own childish folly or an inherent naivety that was adopted in the face of hopelessness, a part of him ached for it to be someone who could help. Jack tested the doors, sliding his finger in the thin opening between it and the frame. To his relief, it moved without any protest nor sound, opening to the room beyond. Sticking his head just barely into the entryway, Jack could see the next room was a branching hallway, what looked like multiple doors in varying states of disrepair, a staircase off to the left, and more scattered pages, fabrics, and boxes filled the space and covered discarded pieces of furniture that were strewn about. The room was absolutely still. The sound remained, emanating from the far end of the hall. Jack slowly crawled through the precipice and into the room, careful not to disturb anything that was scattered along the floor. As he did, the voice became a touch clearer. It was a man's voice, powerful and forcefully energetic, every few syllables internally heightened with passionate flair. Jack could only make out the occasional word.
Forest, together, and I say, every day.
It was coming from a door on the other end of the hall. He was certain of it. Painstakingly slowly, Jack used an arm to lift himself to his feet, remained as crouched as he could with a sharp pain in his twisted ankle. He began to meticulously make his way down the hall, sidestepping loose furniture and avoiding papers and books on the ground. As he passed the staircase to his left, he looked up it with a tightness in his chest, only to see it came to a landing around 90 degrees out of sight. The voice became clearer with each step, and as he finally reached the far door, he could see that it too was left just slightly ajar. The speaker was loud, just on the verge of yelling, but with controlled rage and an unyielding vehemence.
The balloons of the enemy. So he says to us.
Jack was now right up against the door, the opening just wide enough that he could see more moonlight spilling in from outside it. With a wave of pain, he hunched down and glanced through. The door led to what had to be the main cathedral building he'd seen from outside. The chamber was long, with 2 sections of pews stretched out toward closed double doors in the back and a passageway between them. Along the walls on either side were the huge stained glass windows Jack had seen from outside. Some were caked in dirt, others partially broken or boarded up, but they all let in large amounts of moonlight, illuminating the hall in a dull bluish tint. The door Jack was looking through was positioned at the front of the room, up on the stage, and just behind the pulpit. There were figures in the pews. Not many, maybe 10 or 12. They were aimlessly scattered throughout the different rows, but there, nonetheless. A pair sat in the very front, their whole visage visible to Jack, and the visage was horrific. The couple were human, normal-sized and listening intently. They seemed to be a man and a woman, but they looked wrong. Their figures were a deep, dark, reddish color. No semblance of clothing could be seen, and at first it bewildered Jack's brain to try and sort out what he was looking at. As his eyes adjusted to the increase in light, however, some of their details began to elucidate. They were red, fleshy, and their skin looked stringy. With unrelenting disgust and unwelcome panic, Jack realized that the figures had no skin. The reddish color they reflected came from a mix of exposed sinew, tendons, and viscera. He could see individual muscles, how they connected and contracted with the slightest movement. The twitches of flesh caused ripples of tension in the tendons. Their eyes protruded just too far, and their eyelids wrapped all too tightly around their sockets. The woman in the front had her arms wrapped around her chest, holding something in place. A baby. It was partially skinned as well. Jack could see the mother was using her other hands to peel back layers of healthy skin at the child's waist, discarding them on the seat beside her. The infant nursed on its mother's breast, a disquieted mess of muscle, veins, and a circle of mammary glands coming to a point. Jack could see that as it nursed, the baby occasionally leaked out of its tiny mouth. In place of milk, a viscous black liquid spilled from its cheeks, covering its own face and the mother's breast, dribbling down to its freshly peeled belly. Jack felt vomit rise in his stomach and rapidly shoot to his throat, but he forced his airways closed and swallowed it back down in revolt. He dared not draw any attention to himself. The couple, along with every other member of the congregation, despite their horrid appearance, were singularly enraptured by the thing that stood at the pulpit. The owner of the voice Jack had heard. Standing at the pulpit was a behemoth of a figure. It resembled a man only in that it clearly had a head and 2 arms. Its torso was an enormous mound of fat and folds that rolled over one another and spilled around the podium itself, leaving any possibility of it having legs underneath completely to Jack's imagination. Its skin was a pasty, pocked white color. Its balding head had only a speck of thinning black hair. It wore a gray suit of sorts, stretched to impossible extents by the sheer mass of its body and not nearly long enough to cover the lower rounds of bleach-pale fatty skin that pooled below. Dried black sludge ran down the front and side of its body, seeping into every fold before spilling over onto the next. From his angle, Jack could only see the back right side of the figure, but he could hear its thunderous voice. A deep drawl and wetness accompanied its diction.
And the good book says, my brothers and sisters, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his step. That's Proverbs 16:9, I tell you. Scripture itself pleads with us to trust in his decisions.
As the thing spoke, globules of viscous black liquid spit from its mouth, flying onto the pulpit and the steps in front of the stage it stood on. The liquid landed and immediately began to curdle and dry, the moonlight betraying its texture as a mix of solid chunks and saliva.
And so I tell you, oh my ever so joyous congregation, we must turn from man's sinful will. For the Lord is the only safe arbiter of our lives. Fear it. Fear it, I say. Fear the tolling of the beast, lest it find you.
The creature had one hand braced against an open book on the pulpit. The black liquid spewing from its lips had built up and solidified against both the book and the hand, leaving a thick, dripping block of black tar, like a semi-melted wax candle, cementing the arm to the tome and the tome to the lectern.
I say to you, brothers and sisters, fear the Epilogi and the Mandevilla blooms. Fear their encroachment. Hide from it, and let the Lord free us of these burdens.
Whatever pitiful hope Jack had been trying to stamp down in his chest evaporated as he watched the scene. The preacher continued, never stopping for a breath, never taking a respite, and the congregation never broke their concentration on his performance. With every ounce of self-control he could muster, Jack went to turn and slip back down the hall, far away from this. As he did, a pair of large, wet, sinew-streaked arms wrapped around his neck from behind. Jack's breath caught in his throat, and the muscle fibers compacted his trachea. His hands shot up and tried to pry their way between the arm and his own chin, but to no success. His legs kicked against the floorboards as he felt his back slam into the owner of the arm, suffocating him. His splintered skin met with the flayed chest muscle of his assailant and shot knives of pain up his spine. As he attempted to gasp for breath, his throat spasmed and coughed out the remaining air in his lungs. The figure behind him shot a leg out to kick the door to the cathedral open, calling out with a hoarse, masculine voice to those inside.
Father Delos, I've found.
Jack's fingers remain unable to separate the forearm from his throat. As his vision grew fuzzy, he instead forced his nails into the strands of exposed muscle. They parted with some effort, like thick, taut noodles, allowing Jack to tear into the roughage of the flesh and yank it hard. The figure let out a cry and the arm loosened, shoving Jack through the doorway onto the horrid preacher's stage. He attempted to catch himself, but his vision had not fully recovered. Between the panicked gasps for new available air and the oxygen-deprived spinning of the world around him, Jack's legs gave out, and he fell hard onto his side. The sounds that reached Jack took a moment to become intelligible again, as his body once again began diverting energy to his senses now that the threat of suffocation had dissipated. There were gasps, multiple voices from different directions all over each other. Jack's left arm branched against the floor to push him to standing, and in doing so, landed in a lukewarm puddle of what looked and felt like tar. Buzzing with fear and decomposure, Jack saw that the monstrosity at the pulpit had begun heaving the mass of its body toward him, sending rivers of its black sludge flowing across the wooden stage and causing them to pool nearby. Jack came to a shakily upright position. In his periphery, he could see the skinless figure of the man who choked him out approaching, blood flowing from the ripped thew of his arm. Nearly falling forward, Jack's wherewithal began to return. He dashed down the stage steps and began towards the aisle of pews, making for the double doors at the end of the sanctuary. As he did so, he could see the preacher begin to shift his immense form. Up on the wall behind him, a huge crucifix was hung. A painted wooden figure of Christ was mounted upon it, with braided, deep, brownish maroon roots weaving in and out of his skin. Small, pink flowers dotted the vines. Crusted, black slime had dried along its chin and cheekbones, spilling from the open mouth and empty eyes. Scraping noises pursued Jack from all sides as he sprinted down the ratty carpet. At this point, his vision had fully recovered, revealing that he was flanked on each side by flayed members of the congregation, all scrambling hand over foot down their pews toward him. Rippling scarlet arms reached out from the aisles as Jack passed. He dodged the first, but the second scraped at his left shin, causing him to stumble. The third grasped his other ankle, sending him toppling onto his elbows. The rest of the arms were on him quickly. He might have been able to struggle out of the first one's grip, but before he could even get one leg back up, he had the weight of 3 more on top of him. They grappled and pinned his arms to his sides, shoving his cheek into the coarse, dirty fabric of the carpet.
Let go of me.
Jack's voice came out chopped and wispy. His throat was still hurt, and his lungs were squeezed tight between the body above him and the floor. The flayed men pinned him down, pushing down with all their weight, and started to twist him off his stomach. His back shrieked in pain as they turned him over and pressed it to the ground. Jack's heart raced as he found himself staring at the church's peaked ceiling above him. Sections of the partially rotted wood had given way, leaving makeshift skylights that spilled moonlight into the cathedral. 4 men from the pews had him pinned in the aisle. 2 were holding down his arms against his side, with a hand on his shoulder and one on his wrist. The other 2 each pinned his legs, kneeling over his shins and holding his hips in place. Jack tried to twist and struggle against them, but each movement sheared the burns on his back against the floor, sending waves of agony throughout him that threatened to make him black out. From between his feet, he could see the preacher slowly approaching. The gelatinous mass of its body lumbered down the aisle, swaying to the left, then to the right, and back again. Jack screamed out. He pleaded for help, for them to stop, for the chance to explain, but the thing that had been called Father Delos continued its march.
A lost lamb come to us by way of the forest.
The preacher's massive throat warbled as its wet voice filled the chamber. All the congregates gave an affirming hum in response.
Run ashore by Epilogi, no doubt.
As the preacher spoke, black sludge pooled in the recesses of its lips and began to dribble down its neck.
Come, little lamb, our Lord in his mercy offers you comfort, protection, solace, release from her curse, the beast.
The preacher reached Jack. As it did, layers of its fat covered Jack's legs, allowing the skinned men who had been pinning them down to release and return to the pews, where the rest of the congregation was watching. The men holding his arms remained. Jack tried to kick, but was held solidly in place by the preacher's mass. The behemoth leaned forward till its face was directly over Jack's, staring straight down into his eyes. Jack pleaded, his voice a shrill imitation of itself.
Please, I didn't mean to come here. I'm just lost. I'll leave. I'll never tell anyone about this place. Please, just let me go.
The preacher looked at him and gave a stomach-churningly sad and earnest grin, like a parent envying the naivete of a child. Its mouth was a row of thin gray teeth with large gaps in between them. Jack could see the edges of the bones were discolored with black stains, and more of the inky slime was running along its gums.
And yet, here you came, my son. You took your path, and it brought you here. I pity you for what horrors you were no doubt subjected to from the turns you made along the way. We offer you, now, the Lord offers you freedom from that yoke.
At that, the congregation's collective voice rose in unnatural elation. The preacher's face was now directly above Jack's own, looking straight down at him.
Freedom from folly, little lamb. Do not go back into that dark forest, child. Eat with hearts and be full.
From behind, Jack could hear the approach of another figure. Sure enough, a pair of skinless hands reached from out of view and grabbed his head. One gripped his forehead, while the other tightened around his jaw. As Jack began to yell, the hands pulled, forcing his mouth open. Jack screamed a deep, deep scream, and water found its way back to his tear ducts. He cried as he fought to get free, but to no avail. The preacher's grin turned into a wide yawn, then something even further. The mouth opened broader than any joints should have allowed. The rolls of its body racked violently, and Jack could hear a guttural spurting coming from its throat. All at once, the thick, black liquid came up from the preacher's stomach, then fell into Jack's open throat. The slime hit his tongue and was surprisingly sweet. It was warm. The texture varied widely from smooth as silk to ridden with gelatinous chunks. His gag reflex fought the onslaught immediately, sending globules of the sludge back out and spilling them over his face. But the downpour kept coming. Eventually, Jack's body was forced to swallow instinctually. It was a nightmare. A horrid, horrid nightmare that he would sooner die than spend another moment in. Jack flailed his arms as wildly as he could, but the flayed men held fast, keeping his forearms pinned to the sides of his legs and leaving him with only the range of motion of his wrist. Despite having every desire to suffocate on the black sludge and end his torment, Jack's body continued to reflexively swallow, hoping it could make way for air to get to his lungs. He cried and fought, his heart beating so hard and fast that it pounded against his skin. Jack's hand slammed against his pocket in the struggle. There was something there. As quickly as he could with his limited movement, Jack's hand shot into his pocket and pulled the object from it. The salt packet from the diner. As the sludge pooled up and over his open mouth, it poured across his face, forcing him to shut his eyes. In that terrible darkness, Jack ripped the packet in two using his thumb and index finger. Then, cupping the salt in the palm of his pinned hand, slammed it into the uncovered sinew and muscle of the arm securing him there. The salt dug into the exposed flesh, and without skin to cover it, the pain must have been immediate. The churchgoer released Jack's arm and lurched to his feet, howling. As he did so, his head and shoulder collided with the preacher, throwing it off balance and cutting off the torrent of sludge. The preacher's massive form suddenly shifted, forcing everyone else in the tight quarters off balance. There was only a split second where the pressure on Jack's body let up, but in that heartbeat, Jack spun, kicked his knees, and pushed off, falling into a full-on sprint like he had taken off on a 100-meter dash. The slime that had covered his face thinned a bit as it sloughs to the floor, and he gagged and spit violently as he ran, sending the black muck in his mouth to the ground. The preacher's sopping, wet southern drawl echoed through the hall behind him as the mob regained its composure.
Flee, flee and sequester thyself, child. Take my blessing and bathe in its refuge. Lest the Lord forsake you, and the Mandevilla blooms find you.
Jack could scarcely parse the words he heard as his bruised shoulders slammed into the large double doors. Thankfully, the doors burst apart, and Jack found himself stumbling across the open field once again toward the dark forest ahead, a pale bluish moon offering what little light it could. As he passed the tree line, Jack risked a glance behind him. No one was following. The church doors he'd burst through had been closed tight, but he kept running. He ran and ran. Jack couldn't be sure how far he'd gone. There was nothing but trees surrounding him now, and no sign of the church nor clearing. As he took another fevered stride, his leg muscles spasmed and faltered, causing him to rapidly meet the forest floor. In a panicked thrashing, Jack scrubbed and scratched at his face, sending the already dying black muck flying across the grass. With considerable effort, Jack forced himself to his knees and braced an arm against a nearby tree. With the other hand still partially coated in grime, he pointed his index and middle finger and reached as far down his throat as he could. His stomach lurched and his arm shot from his mouth as he kneeled over in a forced gag. The violent upheaval didn't produce anything. Jack tried again, forcing his hand even deeper and holding it longer before crumbling into a dry, heaving arc. Nothing. Jack tried again and again and again to force the muck he'd swallowed out of him. He triggered his gag reflex until his already crushed throat was bleeding from the coughing, and his chest and airways burned with stomach acid. His eyes were red with tears and bulged against their sockets with each urgent retch, but not a single drop expelled itself from his throat. His exhaustion tightened around him like a noose. In mid-heave, Jack's world went dark as he fell against the tree. Part 5. The stairs were taller than Jack remembered. He stood at the top of them. One foot had been outstretched just a moment ago with the intent to find the first step. But now, Jack balanced there delicately, both hands gripping the railing. Just as his foot was about to meet the stair, it had fled from him, stretching downward and away along the rest of the staircase, elongating in Jack's vision, as his head flushed with heat and dizziness. After a moment of focused breathing, his deep perception corrected itself, and Jack carefully let the foot find purchase on the landing. Hands still wrapped around the banister to his right, he took the next step equally as slowly. Whether that was out of cautiousness or inebriation, he wasn't sure. The way the steps moved and shifted was funny, made him want to giggle.
I'm the one with the goddamn cancer. You don't get to play high and mighty anymore. Nobody gets to judge me anymore. That's my reward for life, fucking me over.
There was that voice again. It was coming from down the stairs. The volume of the argument was as painful to Jack as it was nauseating, like the sound waves were disturbing the delicate balance his stomach had found. The other voice, the female one, rose up in response, just as loud as its partner, with a cold control the other lacked.
Just like you, to make everything an excuse. If you think I will sit by and let you ruin our family's reputation, then you...
Fuck you and your reputation.
The man's voice cut her off. She raised her tone further in reprisal.
For Christ's sake, Clark, it's not my reputation. Don't you get that? Think about our boys. What people would say if they see you like this. Or heaven forbid, they were to find out.
Don't you bring the boys into this. You don't give a shit about them, and everybody knows it. They're just fucking dolls for you to dress up and parade around like the prissy bitch you are.
Jack reached the bottom of the stairs. The sudden level of his newfound footing sent another wave of unsteadiness rushing to his brain. He sucked in a deep breath and closed his eyes. In and out. Just needed another bottle. He turned the corner into a wide dining room. Along the far wall, a dark wooden cabinet stood, with china and trinkets hidden behind the glass panes of the upper doors. Atop the cupboard, a small cross was leaning against the off-white of the drywall. The dining table sat in the middle of the room. It was a humble wooden structure, with a vase of nearly wilted, pinkish flowers sitting absently at its center. The left wall of the room opened up into the kitchen beyond, where two figures stood around an island. The third person, a small child, sat in a high chair nearby.
Yes, fall back on profanities like you always have. Set a great example for your son. You think you're such a big man that this is your moment to finally stick it to me?
Yeah, Janine, maybe I fucking do. Maybe this is my moment.
The male voice was clearer now, every other syllable slurred slightly into the next.
Doesn't that just piss you off? That I might be right one goddamn time?
Jack tried, and given his struggles with the staircase, likely failed to keep his footsteps light as he crossed toward the cabinet. The bottles were in the bottom drawer, or was it the middle? Jack almost laughed aloud before he caught it in his throat. He felt funny. The female voice ignited again.
You know, I pray to God every night that he'll take you from me. Some terrible accident or other, so I can raise these boys without having to fend you and your poison off every day. I knew you were dirty the day I married you, and now God's punishing me for my willfulness. A drunken, cowardly, godless man.
Jack was on the cabinet now. The figures arguing were right in his periphery, but they were turned toward each other. He fumbled with the latch mechanism. It didn't make sense anymore. He'd just opened it earlier that night. Why was it so much harder now? He nearly giggled again.
Oh, and you think you're doing them any fucking favors? Having a self-righteous, arrogant prick of a mother? Ha!
The man's voice was interrupted by a deep belch that he quickly recovered from before continuing.
You think you're so much better than me, don't you? I know you. You're nothing.
Jack got the latch to click as he heard a loud swish of liquid from the kitchen, followed by a rapid gulping sound.
Nothing but a 2-cent, worth nothing, life-ruining whore.
The cabinet door swung open, and Jack snatched the first bottle he saw. It didn't matter which one. He had to make it back up those stairs. He hoped they hadn't gotten any longer since his last encounter. It was only as he turned that, with a mix of regret and fear, he saw the woman in the kitchen had taken notice of him and was looking his way.
Look what you did. Look what you did. Called your wife a whore in front of your son. Real class act, Clark. Really making the most of your moment, aren't you?
Jack wanted to run, but his muscles took quite a while to get the message. It felt like his whole body was semi-melted. It made him want to chuckle again.
Tell him, Jack.
The woman turned back toward the man, her voice both thunderous and calculated as it spiked each word with controlled, icy hate.
Tell him how it breaks your heart to have a father like him. A no-good, do-nothing who drowns himself in a bottle and the bodies of other men to avoid watching over his own fucking family.
Jack wanted to be back in the stairs again, where things were quieter. The bottle would take him there again. He would make it take him there. The voices dulled a bit as Jack's perception was assaulted with another wave of nausea and fatigue. Jack didn't feel like giggling. He was walking when he returned to consciousness. Jack's head was hung, but as his eyes blinked and light reached them again, his surroundings slowly defined themselves from a grayish-blue fuzz to a picture of the forest floor. He saw his feet below him, stepping casually but intently, propelling him along. He could see the front of the sweater he wore. Penny's sweater, with its brownish-maroon threads. They were steeped in a dried black mucus, the refuse that had spilled from his open mouth when the preacher had pinned him to the ground. The air was cold on his skin, and despite his disapproval, Jack's sense of touch began to return to him, only to remind him of his horridly mangled back and barely operable limbs. As the surreality of his situation returned to him, Jack did not cry. He figured he probably should, but the depth of his exhaustion seemed to disagree. Yet, for no particular reason he could find, he continued to walk. Looking up, he took in the woods around him. The forest around him was not the same as the one he'd passed out in. The trees were one much larger. Their trunks were thick and jettisoned into the sky above. They were spaced much farther apart than the trees he'd collapsed among as well. As Jack walked in the space between them, he had nearly 10 feet of empty distance on either side. The night was the same, however. The moon was nowhere to be seen, but its light filled the vacuous forest he walked through with a blue tint that betrayed only as much of the forms around it as was needed for traversal. The canopy had larger openings in the foliage, and through them Jack could see the stars against the black-blue backdrop of space. Once Jack's vision had restored itself, his hearing followed suit. The forest was still, unnaturally silent, save for a hint of a sound pulled along by the wind behind him. It was metallic, artificial. It came and went like a wave, building and building only to dampen again. A siren. Jack's trauma-induced apathy was cut short as his body somehow found whatever adrenaline and instinct that remained in its reserves and spiked his heart rate in panic. Jack's head spun behind him as his sprained ankles shot from a saunter to a stumbling run. There was nothing but fog-filled space and monstrous trees as far as his straining eyes could make out, but the sound coming from behind him was unmistakable, and it was getting louder, fast. The darkness of the night cut his line of sight off significantly, turning the gaps between distant trees into curtains of silvery black that seemed to echo the ambulance call, like the forest itself had opened its mouth and was building a horrible howl in its throat. Jack ran again, as he had so many times through the woods, his ankles seared with pain at each step, but the building pressure of the siren behind him insisted at their continued agony. His back bled, and his shoulders popped as his arms pumped his momentum forward, but he could not stop. Suddenly, Jack found the trees around him beginning to be replaced with small, wooden, torn-down structures. A shell of a cottage with its windows and walls collapsed, a well with its stones spilling onto the forest floor, tents and posts twisted onto their sides. As Jack sprinted, he soon found himself in the center of what was some sort of dilapidated encampment. It was then that his right ankle snapped. The unrelenting pressure of sprinting had pushed the hyperextended tendon farther than it could handle, and what would have just been a hairline fracture had been pounded to its limit, until one last impact splintered it into a breakage of bone and marrow. Jack collapsed forward, and his leg bent without the support of its base.
He shrieked in pain and rolled onto his side, tenderly reaching for the ankle. The bone did not break through his skin, but it lunged outward, pushing the epidermis with it. He had no time to think. The siren sound behind him had done nothing but get louder and closer as he'd been running. Pain tugged at the edges of his vision as he looked around desperately. The ancient campsite was a mess of toppled stones and caved-in huts. There, about 30 feet from him, Jack saw the rickety remains of a shed. The whole thing was angled ever so slightly, but remained upright. A rough-looking door made of old, dried wooden planks hung open on its hinges. In the sea of other structures that surrounded him, it was small and inconsequential, easy to miss. With considerable effort and numbing amounts of pain, Jack pulled himself to all fours, save his shattered ankle that dragged behind him. He crawled as fast as he could toward the shed, his ankle screaming in protest as it caught on the occasional root or mound of grass. After what felt like an eternity, Jack found himself at the precipice of the structure. It was so much smaller than he'd initially guessed. It must have been a tool shed of some sort. The interior wall had hooks and posts in place along it. In its entirety, it was just deep enough to stand in with some wiggle room. Carefully, to avoid putting any weight on his ankle, Jack knelt and gasped at one of the hangers, pulling himself up to a shaking stand before grabbing the door and latching it closed. The darkness forced its way in with the closing of the door. While not pitch black, Jack's eyes still took a few moments to adjust as best they could. Small slivers of moonlight slipped through the dried-out cracks in the shed's walls. His arms shook ever so slightly with effort as he relied on them to keep weight off the broken foot. His breathing was ragged. Lungfuls of air were loud and rushed as his body fought off the exhaustion that threatened to overtake it. With every ounce of willpower he had left, Jack closed his eyes and forced his breathing to slow as much as it could. From wheezes to coughs, coughs to gasps, and gasps to whispers. Jack breathed only when absolutely necessary. His ears ached with the sound of the ambulance siren, which grew closer and closer. As it approached, he could hear the Doppler effect of the siren's spin. He could picture the metal cone sitting on top of the impossibly real body of a little girl, spinning. The sound was muffled at first, only to build and build until it crescendoed as it faced him, then faded again as it continued its revolution. Jack's heart slammed against his chest, urging him to panic and pleading for oxygen as he limited his breath. Breathe in. Wait. Listen. Wait. Breathe out. He felt his tear ducts come to life again as the sound outside grew and grew. He could feel the blood pushing against his veins as his broken mind begged for his reasoning to explain all this. The ambulance siren became louder and louder outside. Jack's ears throbbed. He desperately wanted to cover them with his hands, but grit his teeth and bared it for fear of falling should he let go of the hanger supporting his weight. Just when he felt his eardrums might rupture, the volume leveled off. The artificial whooping of the siren was close. It no longer came from the woods he had just run through, but rather from the center of the encampment where he'd fallen. The sound oscillated meticulously, and as it did, Jack grimaced in pain at each crescendo, picturing the siren pointing directly at the shed, at him, before patiently moving past. Jack's stomach shrunk. He knew it was out here. That sound reaching him from beyond the door refused to move, spinning, scanning. His body felt both frozen and far too hot. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead, and his mind was assaulted by a deluge of vertigo, nearly loosening his grip on the posts holding him in place. It was like a fever had come on all at once. His throat felt arid and his head swollen. He was sick, terrified, nauseous, unsure, weak, crippled, guilty. In that instant, the rotation of the siren shot around, the volume increasing as it did. The sound was piercing. It did not relent, and, with a petrifying complacency, Jack knew it had stopped its spinning, facing directly at him. It saw him. More than that, the sound found him. It surrounded him. It knew him in full. He was naked, made small by the force of it. Jack's breath left his body, and he seized in fear-stricken paralysis as the noise approached the shed door. Jack could do nothing but stare. His jaw may have hung open. He didn't know. His hands clung to the wall without his permission, in a sort of pre-rigor mortis.
The whole world was that door standing just in front of him, and the sound screaming through it from the other side. The rays of moonlight that poked through the holes in the wood went dark as something blocked their path. Completely and instantly, the siren ceased. Jack's ears struggled to make sense of the ringing silence left in its wake. He felt like he could hear the movement of the dust that floated in the air. The moonlight, however, did not return. That thing now stood just on the other side of the door. No sound to imply its proximity, but there nonetheless. Slowly and silently, like tiny little garter snakes, Jack saw sickly, brownish maroon roots peek underneath the door. They made no sound. They twisted and slid as they extended onto the rotted wood floor. New vines sprung from the sides of the door as well, clinging to the interior walls and forking into countless new branches. Then came more to the top of the door frame, clutching the irregularities in the roof and making their way toward Jack over his head. Interweaving to the holes in the wood and one another, the roots surrounded him from every direction. Jack's eyes had glazed. His body turned to stone from the physical and emotional contusions. He could not move nor speak, only scream into the echo of his mind. The vines reached him, but they did not touch him. They could not. They curved around his feet, his shoulders, his head, creating a ragged outline of his sorry state against the boards of the shed. They waited there, poised and hungry. Jack's chest heaved with uncontrollable breathing, yet he was still lightheaded, like the air had lost its oxygen. Strange, he realized, even his gasps didn't make a sound. A moment passed, then another. All at once, deep pink flowers began to bloom from the roots. All across them, in every direction, like hundreds of tiny fireworks all going off in sync, they blossomed and spread themselves open. They surrounded Jack and dotted the interior of the shed like stars in the night sky untainted by city lights. It was then that the door opened. Not fully, just a crack, enough to allow a small figure to step into the cramped space with Jack. Not the siren girl, he realized. It had its back to him, but it was a person, not a child. The back of its head was facing Jack, showing short, cut, golden hair. No monstrous features, just a kid. As soon as it was entirely in the shed, it closed the door behind it and turned to face Jack, back pressed against the door. It was a boy, pale skin, wearing cargo shorts and a faded dark blue graphic tee. He couldn't be any older than 3 or 4, and his face. Jack knew the face. From the depths of his psyche, Jack found his voice again, and cracking and hoarse with fear, broke the supernatural silence that filled the tiny shed. Dean. The boy stared back at him. Its soft blue eyes were calm and studying. Its mouth a thin line. The skin of its face was soft and clean, the kind of texture that only comes from a lack of years to weather it down. The boy opened its mouth awkwardly, like it was the first time ever doing so. A sound came from deep in its chest, deep and shifting, like a radio being turned to the right frequency. The sound that came from the boy's mouth changed as it went, before it found its footing as a perfect copy of Jack's. Jack's face went numb. His body separated from him as he failed to do anything but watch. He was sick. So sick. His throat managed to release a sputtering.
Please. Why? Please stop.
The boy looked back at him, as calm as he was motionless.
I never had a voice of my own.
Jack's eyes, despite everything they had seen thus far, began to well up as his face contorted in fear, shame, terror, and disgust. The boy's mouth opened wide, wider than it should. Its chin slid downward like a wooden poppet, the skins of its cheeks stretching beyond their limits to accommodate the shift. It stood there like that for a moment, with its jaw unwound into a pit of black, before sound drifted up from its throat. Not a voice, but audio. The sounds of a scene.
Don't bring him into this!
The voice that the boy's mouth produced was not Jack's. It was another man's, and it had an echo and a shape to it, like it came from a room away, The voice rose again, its words slurred.
You think he needs to hear this? Fucking hell, Janine. For once in your life, stop pawning off your shit on these kids and face something yourself.
Jack wanted to ask, to beg the boy in front of him to stop this, to close its mouth. But his own throat was so horribly tight that it was all he could do to get air to his lungs. A female voice rose in protest from deep in the boy's throat.
Face something myself. That's rich coming from you. You think you're special? Millions get diagnosed every year, Clark. That doesn't give you an excuse to ruin our lives.
The man's voice cut through the air louder and faster than it had before.
You're the only reason I took that goddamn job in the first place, you sanctimonious bitch. Oh, big words coming from the drunkard over here. Do you know what that word means, Jack? I doubt your dad does. I said, stop bringing my son into this. Why? Afraid your son will learn his father is a drunkard?
The voices went silent. The tension extended beyond the scene. Jack felt every muscle freeze in a strain. The air around him pregnant with anxiety, awaiting a reaction. The man spoke again.
You bitch.
From the boy's mouth came a whooshing sound. Jack recognized it. A glass bottle being thrown. There was a flurry of noise and a sickening, scraping thud, followed shortly by the sound of glass shattering against tile. There was another moment of silence, filled not with fear, but with shock. Then came the shriek of a child, the unrelenting squealing of a toddler in genuine pain. The woman's voice rose again, unsettlingly calm and smug, despite the bellowing cry of a child overlaying it.
Look what you did now, Clark. Does that make you feel good? Do you see why I'm right about you? Why I've always been right about you?
The roar of the child peaked and continued. Jack's body shuddered at each cresting of the bellow. Every instinct in him urged him to help.
Dean, I didn't mean...
The man's voice was softer now, beaten.
Oh, you didn't mean that, did you, Clark? That just makes it so much better, doesn't it, Dean? Tell Daddy it's all better now. You know what, Clark?
The voices dulled against the ever-increasing shriek of the child. They continued to scream at one another, to argue. All the while the child grew louder and more pained. There was a rush of sound. Jack knew what it was. He could see the scene in his mind as the noises emanated from the boy's gaping mouth. The scurry of feet on tile, picking up the bleeding infant, and the swinging of a screen door being bashed open. The distant protests of the man and woman behind him, demanding he stop. The rushed opening of a car door, followed by its slamming closed. The voice that came from the boy's mouth was Jack's own now, much younger. It was wet with tears and sloppy with effort.
We're leaving.
The click of keys entering an ignition came next, followed by the disapproving roar of an engine stuttering to life.
I'll get you safe.
The younger Jack's voice was broken between weeping and gags. His words came out in a teary slur. Tires spun out against the asphalt before catching. The sound of a car frantically flying down the road filled the tiny shed, as distant yells insisted it turn around. The voices dimmed as the sounds became entirely those of driving down back roads. The occasional screech of tires correcting their trajectory interrupted the rhythmic bump of the engine and the cries of the child. Jack could hear the sloshing of liquid, the sound of a deep swallow. Even hanging here in this shed, he swore he could feel the burn of fiery liquor in his own throat.
Don't worry, Dean. We won't get fucked.
A shriek of tires and brakes blasted from the boy's open mouth, the sounds of rubber and dirt and metal coming into contact. Then, it was silent. Horribly, accusatorily, completely silent. Patiently and intentionally, the boy's mouth shut itself. Jack could see the skin contract in relief, and the jawbones click back into place as it did so. Jack's body was broken, and now we could feel the foundation of his spirit crumbling. The skeleton of will and thought that made him up. His emotional bones had begun to snap. As the boy's mouth shut, Jack felt a vibration in the left pocket of his jeans and heard a familiar tone. His phone was ringing. The boy looked passively down toward Jack's pocket, then brought its eyes back up to Jack's expectantly. Jack's heart was shredded and pounding, and he could feel the blood in his forearms as he found himself reaching and pulling out the phone. Call from Ben. Senseless and with stinging pain in his temple, Jack swiped to answer and held the phone to his ear. Sound played from the speaker before he could say a word. His own voice came through first, screaming,
I killed him. Don't you fucking get that? I killed him, Penelope.
Penelope's voice interrupted him, also shouting with anger. Just hearing her again brought a stifled sob to Jack's lungs.
You ever think that maybe you need to grow the fuck up and move on, Jack? Otherwise, you might as well have died in that car too.
One last tense silence filled Jack's ears before he heard himself through the crackling speaker of the phone again, his voice calm but with hate behind every syllable.
Fuck you, Pen. I hope you wake up hungover with a dead baby in your stomach.
The phone call cut, leaving a numbing dial tone playing in his ear. Jack's hand fell to his side, limp. The phone clattered onto the mix of roots and floorboards below. With tears smudging every part of his vision, Jack looked, pleading, into the eyes of the boy in front of him. It spoke with Jack's voice one more time. You'll get them killed too. The door behind the boy exploded inward. A sharp and ragged branch jammed through it directly into the back of the boy's skull. The sound of the door splintering was that of metal crumbling and glass shattering. Tires shrieked. In an instant, the branch punctured through the boy's head and shot out his mouth, lifting him off the floor. Blood erupted onto Jack's sweater and its brownish-maroon threads. The boy's body hung there, skewered from the nape of his neck to his mouth by the bloodied branch. Without moving, Jack's stomach let up its contents. Black bile rose through his throat and rolled out of his mouth onto the floor with a wet thud. His arms released the hooks holding him up, and the ankle buckled under the weight, sending him toppling over, reduced to a kneeling pile of flesh and regret at the boy's dangling feet. Jack remained there, his lips and chin dripping with black viscous fluid. He was no longer there, in truth. Even the echo in his mind that had been screaming and clawing against his shock to fight back was now silent and unfeeling. The shed was somewhere far away from him. The roots began their march again, no longer concerned with the borders of his personage. His feet, arms, and head each had strands of vines spread across them, just enough to tighten a grip on him. The brownish-maroon, bloodied branch in front of him still held the boy's body aloft, but it began to shift. It fell in on itself and changed shape, becoming smoother, rectangular. Its coloration took on a dirtier metal tint as the boy's body also elongated, his shorts and shirts combining and stretching into an old, faded flower dress, the blood turning to dirty stains. In front of Jack now stood the girl again. From her head came the familiar wail of an ambulance siren. Jack simply looked at her. He could not move. He would not feel. Calmly, the girl reached and took hold of his wrist, pulling him from the shed and dragging him out along the forest floor. Jack's skin and head bounced against the roots that grew in the girl's steps. He could see the world on its side. The fog of the night subsumed the tiny shed behind them, and soon the entire encampment. How long he was dragged along the forest floor, Jack did not know. The trees changed, trunks thinned, and the forest grew compact once again. Jack did not blink. His eyes stung, and his charred back felt like it was searing anew against the pine needles and rocks of the ground. Eventually, the grass and dirt gave way to even harder and more unforgiving pavement. Jack could see streaks of red and black and brown left in his wake along the asphalt. Smears and bits and pieces of the curdled flesh of his back were torn against the grain as he went. He didn't quite understand what he was looking at. With a hint of confusion, Jack realized he'd stopped moving. More than that, the ever-present sound of the ambulance siren had stopped, but his arm was still held tightly over his head. He craned his neck to look at the thing dragging him. The siren girl stood now at the intersection in the road. In front of her was a large yellow street sign with a dual-sided black arrow emblazoned in its center, gesturing in either direction. Behind the sign rose a wooded ridgeline that stretched alongside the road. The girl stood there for a moment. Then she ducked beneath it, pulling Jack along with her, and stood on the other side, dragging him up the hill. The ascent was even more painful than the asphalt. Gravity pulled stubbornly at Jack's body, but the girl's grip was unrelenting, shearing his exposed flesh against the incline. Eventually, the ground leveled out again, and Jack was dragged farther still, before the grip on his wrist was released, and he fell limp onto his back, straining at the stars above. Tiny, pearlescent shines across a sea of black. Jack could feel something moving through the earth beneath him, what felt like thousands of tiny pinpricks across his whole body. In his periphery, he could see his arms being slightly lifted by brownish maroon roots. The roots subsumed his body. Some pierced skin and weaved in and out of his flesh. The branches turned him as they lifted and wrenched his body into a kneeling position. Jack's head hung low. He saw the forest floor in front of him. The entangled roots that had surrounded him had begun to form a sort of trunk around his legs. They wrapped around and spread out into the ground. From his shoulders, tendrils of quick-growing vines slithered along and circumvented his arms, forking branches piercing his biceps and forearms just to come out the other side. The vines reached his hands and semi-enveloped his fingers, leaving his palms exposed. Laying there on the ground in front of him, Jack saw an antler. Broken at the base with dried blood, the tip had been whittled to a deadly point. Distant and confused, Jack's neck strained to lift his head. He knelt in a clearing in the forest. Before him was a semicircle of half-grown tree trunks with brownish-maroon bark. They had no leaves and come to splintering, chaotic points. At the cusp of this semicircle stood the siren girl. She was still, arms at her sides and facing him. Jack squinted. He could feel the roots gliding through his muscles. They were expanding. There was no pain. Maybe it had all been used up. His eyes were drawn to the half-trees again. He could see that there was more to them. Each tree consisted of multiple twisting sections. They wrapped and wove in on one another. And in the center of each tree was a figure. They shared no clear similarities. There were men and women, young and old. Each one was almost entirely encased in the tree, save for one thing. They all had one outstretched arm, wrapped round and round by the roots with their palms exposed. Each individual had a scar on the palm, a shape crudely etched into it. One had a peace symbol, another a cross. Some intelligible attempts at words were scraped into many of them. One had what looked like a pentagram, another an outline of a tree. Others had simply been shorn clean, no skin remaining. Jack felt his arms move, and as they did, he looked down. The roots surrounding his hands had turned his exposed palm toward him and grabbed the sharpened antler with the other. Are you? The sound wasn't a voice. Jack looked up to see it had come from the girl. It was shrill, unnatural, like the siren sound it had been making, but forcibly contorted into language. It was a sound he was sure couldn't be, and yet he heard it come from her. Jack stared for a moment. It was hollow. He glanced at the figures entombed in the trees around him, and then back down at the antler in his hand. Tears fell from his eyes, and mucus and spit ran from his mouth and nose as he lifted the antler to his neck. With as much force as he could gather in his feeble state, he jammed the antler toward his throat, giving one last sob as he did so,
and clench his teeth in expectation. There was no pain. His eyes were closed tightly as he waited. He waited and waited. After a moment, he opened them again. The antler had not reached his neck. The vines surrounding his arm had constricted. The vines surrounding his arm had constricted, holding him back. He pushed against them, but to no avail. Only when he tried to pull the antler away from his throat did they relent and allow him to return it to just above his hand. Jack looked again toward the siren girl and the curve of trees that reached out on either side of her. The figures within them contorted in agony and despair. Shoes. Jack cried. There were no sobs left to give, but the tears flowed from his eyes and dripped from his chin, tinted black against the dried slime that remained there. He looked back to his palm. Shoes. He couldn't. The emptiness that he had merged with was deafening. He was desperation incarnate. He was ambiguous. He was contradictory. Infinite. Tears landed on his hands as he ran the antler across his exposed skin. Blood welled in his palm as the point of the bone tore through him and was dragged along. It thinned and pooled in the lines of his hand and began to drip off the edges. After a moment, he lifted the antler and let it fall to the ground again. Jack looked to the siren girl and line of trees, stoic and expecting in their stillness. He lifted his hand, palm outstretched, and faced it toward them, stained red with freshly flowing blood. A dual-sided arrow had been carved into it. There was a long time where they remained like that. Jack held in his kneel by the roots with his bleeding palm raised. The siren girl stared back in seeming indifference, the bodies encased in trees surrounding them, and the wider forest keeping a silent, watchful guard over their communion. The roots that had woven themselves into Jack retreated. His arms were let free, and his legs unwrapped. They sank back into the ground, and Jack collapsed at the sudden responsibility of his own weight. Reorienting himself, he pushed with his shaking arms to an unstable half-kneel. Looking back toward the siren girl in front of him, he saw her take one step to the side and turn just a bit, leaving an opening in the forest. Jack stood, his ankle fully bent to the side, leaving him lopsided. Blood still fell from his palm as he took a trembling step, then another. His body swayed as he did, from exhaustion, as well as the unevenness of each stride. Slowly, he made his way toward the opening. As he reached it, he found himself walking right past the siren girl, without giving her a second look, nor thought, and out of the clearing he hobbled. Into the trees and the fog, Jack shifted, each limping gait pressing his snapped ankle into a more and more acute angle. The fog was so thick he couldn't see an arm's length in front of him. Each step revealed just enough ground to see where his leg landed. At some point, the dirt beneath him gave way to asphalt again. Jack didn't notice. He kept walking. Only when he took a step and found himself on a thick white highway line did Jack stop. He looked at it, puzzled. Then, turning around, he saw the fog was gone. He stood at the edge of a highway, the off-ramp of an exit behind him. To his left stood a massive green sign held up by twin metal posts with white lettering. Exit 27. Ross Road. His gaze fell down the ramp, where he could make out a distant fork in the road, with a yellow street sign in its center, adorned by a dual-sided black arrow. Jack turned back to the highway, and to his left. The road was silent. The fog had lifted, but the night was still present. All at once, his exhaustion began to return. He could feel every inch of sheared and burned flesh, and suddenly,
His ankle gave way beneath him. He collapsed onto the pavement of the breakdown lane he was standing in, and his head hit the ground. Once again, his world was on its side. He could see the distant horizon of the highway. Was it that far? Or maybe it was just the curve of the road along a hill that cut off visibility. There was the slightest difference of light over that horizon, like lights shining toward him just beyond the bend. Funny, he thought, just in time for the sunrise. And there was a sound, too, faint as the sound could be. But he swore he could hear it coming from just past the limits of his vision. His brain released his consciousness, and Jack let the hint of light take him to a relieving oblivion. He recognized that sound. A siren.
Thank you for listening and delving with me into the dark together.
Please remember to leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you feel so inclined. The more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will push my content to others.
Thus, the following will grow.
All stories read in this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, and just about everywhere else. Links in the description.
Thank you for listening and feeding the cause. We'll be seeing you